Hey sailors, welcome to the crew. I'm Sealord Janda, and this is the Rule the Waves 3 1960 special. Although it's dark, you might be able to tell I'm in a slightly different location. I am in the middle of moving setups, which is why this video is late, and this will probably be the last video recorded on this laptop. Or maybe not, I might not mess with transferring save files, so we might finish the Rule the Waves campaign out on this laptop, but the changeover is happening pretty soon anyway. There'll probably be a vlog or something about it, we'll see. But anyway, for now, the 1960 special. Fleets have changed quite a bit since 1950, with missiles becoming more and more common. I am one of the only countries still running large surface units that aren't carriers, while cruisers become more and more common. So the weakest navy in the world at this point is Spain. We are the strongest by over 600,000 tons ahead of Germany, then Britain, which has the second largest, then Russia, actually, then Britain, which has the second largest budget but only the fourth largest fleet, still recovering from what we did to them in the past, then France, Italy, Japan, Austria-Hungary, and finally Spain. Destroyers are present in insane numbers at this point, along with plenty of cruisers. Not so many ships larger than cruisers, less than in the past, I'm fairly sure. So just taking a look at destroyers first. Also, we have the most naval aircraft, not by much because the AI builds a lot of land bases, but everyone is well into the hundreds, and the top four are all into the over 1,000 now. There's also an increasing number of submarines, although a lot of power is still not using that many of them. Anyway, we'll start as is traditional with destroyers. Spain actually doesn't quite have the weakest destroyer fleet. In fact, Japan does by quite a margin after our war with them. Spain has 79 destroyers, amounting to 179,000 tons in service. I think I pushed everyone to build a lot when I built 100 for myself. The oldest of Spain's are the 20-year-old T-51s with 8 5-inch guns and 2 quad torpedo tubes. Those aren't so bad, but they then followed them with a bunch with 4 4-inch guns, albeit 12 torpedo tubes total, 6 6-inch and 8 4-inch guns. This is a light cruiser. And to be fair, not a bad one necessarily. 36 knots, 6 6-inch guns, 8 4-inch guns. It wouldn't stand up to a real light cruiser, since most of them have like 12 or 15 6-inch guns now, but and at least a little bit of armor. But 36 knots, this is a dangerous destroyer, actually. Albeit expensive, but dangerous. But then they went, after building 2 of them, right back to 4 4-inch or 6 4-inch guns, some with 8 5-inch. There's nothing too radical about this. It was in 1952 with the T-97 class that they began including surface-to-surface missiles. Although these only have 6 5-inch dual-purpose guns, 34 knots not bad, but not spectacular, and 5 torpedo tubes, which is a really weird number. And it kind of looks to me like they have like 1 triple tube here, and unless those are the SS, no, these would be the SSMs. So 1 triple tube, and then I'm guessing a twin tube somewhere that I don't see, but weird torpedo number. So these have surface-to-surface missiles, but they've really skimped on other armament to get it. Then these T-104s have just 2 surface-to-surface missiles and 4 4-inch guns, so they're garbage, basically. They're basically missile boats. And then with the T-110s, they built a class that actually has 8 5-inch guns, 34 knots, 4 surface-to-surface missile launchers. Still only 5 torpedo tubes, but This is at least a modern destroyer. Unfortunately, they only have about maybe like 6 of them. This one kind of counts, just has less surface missiles. Maybe altogether they got like 10. And then they went back down to classes with 6 or 4 or 5-inch guns in order to save money. So, out of those 90 destroyers, maybe 10 could stand up to the average American destroyer out of 100. But it's Spain. What do you really expect from them? Austria-Hungary? Yeah, Austria-Hungary is next. They have 85 destroyers mounting to 212,000 tons, which their oldest are the T-32s from 1935, although at 35 knots, 8 5-inch guns, 2 quadruple torpedo tubes, they're not that obsolete. I mean, they don't exactly stand up in 1960 when I have all missile destroyers, but they could be worse, such as the immediately following class with only 4 5-inch guns. Here they do have these Spalatos, are actually the really big kind with 6 6-inch and 8 4-inch guns. No missiles, but quite formidable, firepower-wise, for a destroyer. Then they went back to 8 4-inch guns, few with 8 5-inch, 8 4-inch, 8 5-inch, 6 6-inch, and 4 3-inch. That's not as great. Still, 6-inch guns hit hard, but I don't know. These did or didn't. Oh, but these did have. Okay, all right, fair enough. These T-62s, just 2 of them, are their first destroyers with SSMs. So 6 6-inch guns, 4 3-inch guns, 4 heavy surface-to-surface missiles, 33 knots, 5 torpedo tubes. Well, it's a fair bit of firepower considering they managed to cram SSMs in as well. They cut a lot of torpedoes to do it, but at some point we had to bid as well, I'm pretty sure. How many do our Ericssons have? 8, yeah, and I think maybe our preceding class had as many as 12. Our latest class only has 4. 5 is kind of a weird layout still, but it's not that big a deal, probably. However, they did then immediately go down to ships with 4 4-inch guns, which are clearly the budget model, before building some pretty standard 8 5-inch gun, 4 torpedo tube, 4 SSM type ships. These are quite nice. It's just they don't make up exactly the whole of their line of battle, but between the Blitz and the T-81 and the T-87s, Austria is doing, and the T-95s, Austria is doing a lot better than Spain in terms of actually having probably something like, I don't know, 30 modern SSM equipped, well gunned, reasonably fast destroyers. Now that still leaves 50 plus that are quite obsolete, but they're not as bad as Spain for sure. Japan's destroyer fleet has just taken a horrific beating. They are down to 61 ships amounting to 138,000 tons, of which they still have a lot of the Hakaze class from back in the 40s, which only have 3 4-inch guns plus torpedo tubes. 4 5-inch, 3 4-inch, 6 4-inch, all sort of hopelessly inadequate in modern combat. At least they're not that slow, but honestly they're not much faster than heavy ships either at this point. They do have some of these Fubukis that are insanely heavily armed with 6 6-inch and 8 5-inch guns, but they only have 2 of them. So, hard to say if that's... I mean, they'd be very dangerous against other destroyers, but they only have 2 of them, so that's the problem, really. And then they went to 8 3... Well, okay. I'm pretty sure there were quite a few more Akatsukis than this one originally, but this is the only survivor. 6 5-inch guns, 35 knots, 4 SSMs, their first SSM class, at least the first that survived. Dang, this one was lucky, actually. Wow, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 battle stars against us. In action every time, by the look of it. Didn't die. And a lot of her sibling, like, I'm pretty sure the whole rest of her class died, along with a lot of other Japanese destroyers. So Usugumo here, a very lucky ship. And not a terrible one. I mean, dropped a 5-inch gun mount and some torpedoes to get those SSMs, which we mostly avoided, but certainly better than the Hibikis with 8 3-inch guns and only 2 SSMs as well. Then the Wakabas, 4 5-inch guns. Kamikaze class. Okay, is this a post-war or was this a late-war class? Or all right, well, this is a pretty standard destroyer anyway. 8 5-inch guns, 4 SSMs, 5 torpedo tubes, 34 knots. Those are all right, but they then went straight back to a terribly budget class with 4 4-inch guns, 2 SSMs, before returning more recently to 3,000 ton, 8 5-inch type. So there's still only 2 SSMs. So, I mean, they've maybe got, a pretty good percentage of their fleet has SSMs because a pretty high percentage of it is very new owing to the war. But a lot of those in turn are small too. They probably only have about a dozen. And these don't even have 4 SSMs, so their fleet overall is still rather shambolic. Probably they have less than a dozen really good modern destroyers. Italy has 77 destroyers, amounting to 173,000 tons, which is the second least tonnage. Still well ahead of Japan, but not a lot. And of those, they have Grecales with 3 6-inch, 4 4-inch guns from back 20 years ago, which fairly reasonable armament, although just strange. I'm not sure it's actually better than 8 5-inch guns, but probably equivalent maybe. Definitely not how I'd do it, but they have a couple with 8 5-inch guns, and then 3 or 4 5-inch guns before they went back to 8, and then to 8 6-inch, 6 5-inch, 6 6-inch, 8 5-inch. I mean, these are exceptionally. These are in the very well armed, basically a light cruiser with no armor type category, which were quite fearsome at the time, but now are rapidly becoming a little bit more obsolete with SSM armed destroyers, which could potentially. It still takes a bit of luck. Missiles are not that good yet, but SSM armed destroyers do have a pretty decent chance of disabling something like this, with the opening salvo. 8 5-inch, 8 6-inch, 6. They do have a lot, relatively speaking, of these really heavy ships, though. So that's a point for them. 8 4-inch guns, 8 6-inch, 6 4-inch. Yeah, a lot of them. And then in 52, everybody pretty much about just early 50s, yeah. Pretty much the same time we did. Comandante Casana, 8 5-inch guns, 33 knots, 4 SSMs, and 5 torpedo tubes. So that's pretty standard, but then they immediately went budget with only 4 5-inch guns on the next class. Fast, but yeah, 3 knots faster, so it's more of a missile boat type thing. Only 2 SSMs as well, though. And they never really went back until very recently. Now they're building 6 6-inch, 4 3-inch, 4 heavy SSMs, 34 knots, 5 torpedo tubes. Well, these are right back in the sort of line of really heavy gun armament, or just heavy armament all around, and big. So, I like these destroyers. It's just Italy. All these big, really heavily gunned destroyers I kind of like. Maybe it's a little too much investment in a destroyer, possibly. Holy cow, these 5. We'll get to those later, but dang. Okay. Yeah, Italy needs a little more in the way of number. We can get away with building all really heavy destroyers. Italy needs to make up the numbers a little more with maybe just standard 8 5-inch or something armed destroyers. Plus SSMs. Wouldn't build a new destroyer without those now. France. 89 destroyers amounting to 204,000 tons. Dead even on tonnage with Britain, albeit with 11 more ships, so France's are quite a bit lighter on average. But there's something to be said for having 11 more hulls also. Now, the oldest of them are useless. These 1,300-ton, 3 5-inch gun things are basically just fast corvettes or something at this point. They have some with 8.5-inch. Okay, they're missile boats, yes. Or not missile boats, torpedo boats. Be more impressive if they were missile boats. They have a few with 8.5-inch, and then they went back to 4.4-inch, 6.4-inch, 8.4-inch. I mean, these are all passable, fast, bunch of torpedoes, 8 guns at least, even if they're 4-inch instead of 5-inch. But they're just a little on the budget side compared to building with 5-inch, and then they went to 6.4-inch. They did run one of those big classes with 6.6-inch, 8.4-inch, but then back to 6, couple 8.5-inch, and then back to 6.4-inch. And then their first SSM class had only 4 5-inch guns, which isn't so impressive either. And it wasn't until these 2 casks, which had 8 5-inch, 4 SSMs, and they only built 2 before mysteriously on the same tonnage dropping back down to 2 SSMs for no clear reason. They have built a bunch of 6.6-inch, 4 3-inch, 4 SSM types recently, which are pretty dangerous at least. Still, overall, you will see probably only 20 or 30 of their destroyers are SSM armed, which is maybe better than some, but not anywhere near as good as us. Now, Britain has 78 destroyers, amounting to exactly the same tonnage as France, but with a bit heavier average. Their oldest types are still 20 years old, a couple with 4 5-inch guns here, 6.4-inch. But they do have a very large class here of Ariels, something like 10 plus of them, with 8 6-inch, 6.4-inch guns, 8 torpedo tubes, 35 knots. I mean, these in a gunfight would be really nasty against pretty much any opposing destroyer. Something with 8 5-inch guns would obviously lose to this most of the time, barring lucky torpedo hits on either side. They dropped down a little, but only to 8 5-inch, well, 8 4-inch at some point as well, which is still not the worst thing in the world necessarily. When they drop down to 6 4-inch, that's where they're going a little too far. And then with the Chalmers, 6 6-inch, 4 3-inch, 4 heavy SSMs, so that's not bad. And then Beagle, 8 5-inch, 2 SSMs. That's rather less armament, actually, but not terrible. Feels like the SSMs are maybe an afterthought at that point on just an 8 5-inch design, but could be worse. Wolverines, 8 5-inch and 4 SSMs. Ooh, the Nemesis class, their latest, though, not good. 4 5-inch, 2 SSMs. Overall, though, they do have, as a proportion, it's hard to judge. It's still probably only 20 or so SSM armed destroyers, but I'm more impressed by what I'm seeing from theirs than I am from some of these others. Well, this Nemesis class excluded, but they do have a lot of 8 5-inch or 6 6-inch, 4 3-inch types. And back in their older destroyers, with a few exceptions, most of them have at least 8 guns, and some of them are really heavy. So, ship for ship, their force is pretty impressive. They just need more of them. Russia, 100 destroyers, second most in the world, at 252,000 tons total, which is third most in the world. Yeah. They also have quite a few of these 20-year-old ships with 3 4-inch guns, which, oh my god, that's a lot of ships with 3 4-inch guns, which are just pure torpedo boats, not very useful. A few with 8 5-inch, but then they went to, well, 3 6-inch, 4 4-inch. I don't know how. I feel like it's worse than 8 5-inch just because it's non-uniform. I don't know what the exact weight of shell comparison is, but the game does account a little bit, I think, for problems with firing non-uniform batteries. It's just kind of a weird thing to do and harder to calculate your aiming, and it's not ideal. So I'd probably rather have 8 5-inch guns. And they did then build a bunch with that, and a little class here with 6 6-inch, 8 5-inch, and then a bunch with 8 6-inch, 6 5-inch or similar. So these are quite powerful all from the late 40s. And then back to 8 5-inch, and then, okay, they really only have a couple of SSM armed classes, but 8 5-inch, 4 SSMs, 3 torpedoes, 35 knots. Ooh, that class is alright. However, they then downsized to 8 3-inch, 2 SSMs, 35 knots, which is not so alright. That's a pretty horrifying gun armament, and not even enough SSMs to make up for it, really. And they then seem to have gone back to basically pretty close to the previous design. Only to go back again, so I don't know what their long-term thinking is there. I mean, it doesn't, the AA doesn't really have any, but still. Germany has the most destroyers in the world by hulls, second most by tonnage at 105 for 280,000 tons. They have some old Z8s from the mid-30s with 3 6-inch, 4 5-inch, 6 4-inch, 4 4-inch, but 12 torpedo tubes. Still not good. 3 6-inch, 4 4-inch, 3 4-inch, 4 4-inch. They do have a pretty substantive class, several classes actually, with 8 6-inch, 6 4-inch, or even 6 6-inch, 8 5-inch, which, I mean, again, these things will be killers against other destroyers. They wouldn't actually beat a light cruiser or anything. To be fair, they're much cheaper and smaller, and they could do quite a bit of damage to a light cruiser, so I wouldn't count these out too much. But then they went back to a 5-inch, which is fine. 8 6, 6 4. Most of their destroyers, I mean, there are exceptions, because then they randomly go back to things like 4 4-inch, but a lot of their old destroyers are very well armed, especially the later ones. The early ones didn't start off so well, but they ended up with very large and well-armed destroyers. And right about 53, they started producing SSM armed ships, starting with 6 5-inch guns, which isn't great, but isn't that bad. They then went down to 4 5-inch and then to 4 4-inch and only 2 SSMs, so they're just building missile boats here. Before they went to 6 6-inch, 4 3-inch. I don't know what their problem with uniform main batteries is, but at least it's got 4 SSMs. 8 5-inch, there we go. And then they went to 2 5-inch with 8 SSMs. Alright, that's unique at least. I haven't seen anybody else do that. I don't quite think the technology is actually mature enough for this to be viable yet. Especially as I don't really think most any ships carry substantial reloads for these. But maybe they have them. Possibly. But 2 5-inch and 8 SSMs seems maybe a little premature. The tech is not quite that good in 1960, I feel like, but we'll see. Could work out for them. I like the uniqueness of it, at least. We currently have 99 destroyers amounting to 303,000 tons because apparently I miscounted at some point. I intended for us to have 100, but 99 it is for now. Of those, probably basically 90 almost are the Ericsson class, built in early, 1950 through 55 was the last one completed. These all 3,000 tons, 8 5-inch guns, 36 knots, 4 heavy surface-to-surface missiles, 2 quadruple torpedo tubes. The main flaw with all these is that I forgot to install dual-purpose main guns on them, which is also part of how they achieve all this on a relatively reasonable tonnage. But their armament is fine, and their speed is fine. Well, other than not being dual-purpose. And overall, they did very passably in the war with Japan. Not spectacularly, but they definitely held their own against Japanese destroyers, and their missiles played a critical role in damaging several Japanese capital ships. Now, most recently, in 57-58, we did put down about, I don't know, a dozen or so of the Warden class, which cuts out rather more of our torpedo tubes in order to get 8 5-inch auto-loading dual-purpose guns. It can also only make 34 knots, and it's 500 tons heavier. And the AA is not even as good either. So there's quite a lot of compromises made in the Warden class, but we do have dual-purpose guns and auto-loading guns, which are both rather substantial advantages. The speed difference is unfortunate. Particularly, I'm less worried about the torpedoes, seeing that all the AI SSM ships pretty much have 5 or 3 or something. I don't love our AA either, although the dual purpose definitely helps. We'll probably have to design something better than the Wardens fairly soon, but this'll do for now. I mean, our destroyer fleet is clearly the most powerful in the world. Nobody else has anywhere close to this many SSM armed destroyers. Probably even Germany only has like maybe 30 or something. We're very much the only ones to have fully converted as of 1960. Now, as for light cruisers, these have become, well, these and heavy cruisers have become have almost mostly replaced heavy surface gun-armed capital ships, but not completely, but close at this point. Spain, as the world's smallest fleet, boasts 10 light cruisers amounting to 109,000 tons worth. Now, 7 of these are the Gravina class from the late 30s, early 40s, with 15 5-inch and 12 4-inch dual-purpose guns. They were probably pretty terrifying in an anti-air role at some point, although that might have been a later refit, in which case when built they weren't that good. Anyway, they'll still be terrifying to any destroyer they should happen to encounter. Not so terrifying to a light cruiser armed with a dozen 6-inch guns, although sheer volume of fire, there's something to be said for that, but overall, not having 6-inch guns is a pretty big black mark against these. And they followed it with three Molinos class, which on a 2,100 tons less manages to have 12 6-inch guns, 12 3-inch guns, 6 torpedo tubes, a bunch of mines, and 32 knots. I'm impressed they did this on so much less tonnage. Quite impressed they did it on so much less tonnage. Makes me wonder why the Gravinas are so heavy. Maybe they went pretty heavy on armor, but not that heavy. I mean, they're also just 10 years older, so that's a big part of it, too. But these are quite nice. I mean, they are actually pretty nice. There's no clear flaws with the Villacretes class, or the Molinos class. They're not going to be world beaters necessarily, but you can't say they're horrifically flawed either. They're not the most modern, considering they don't have any sort of missiles or anything, but few do still at this point. Now, Austria-Hungary has 12 light cruisers, amounting to 132,000 tons, which is effectively what you'd expect from its navy size. Second smallest. That said, they have 3 Jupiters from about 1940, which have 15 6-inch and 12 4-inch guns in what looks like 5 triple mounts for the main guns. Not much any armor. Speed is no longer spectacular. Armament is still very competitive as gun armament goes. I don't really know of any light cruisers that have much better main armament than that. It's just a matter of the latest ones maybe introducing missiles as well. Unfortunately, they then followed that with 6 Taurus class, which with only 14 5-inch guns are a menace to destroyers, but most definitely not a menace to other light cruisers, which will probably pretty much shred these pretty easily, as will anything else larger. This is technically a separate class, but apparently has an inch less of armor, even though it's 100 tons heavier. Same armament, same flaws. Then they have the one-off Pola from 1952, 11,900 tons, 31 knots, 18 6-inch guns in 6 triple mounts, 23-inch, and 2 SSMs thrown in to boot. So this is a pretty mean cruiser, actually. Not the very fastest, but fast enough. 12,000 tons, a lot of guns, a couple of SSMs for good measure, plus still torpedo tubes, plus a lot of mines. I'm guessing it's probably short-ranged and cramped or something, but it seems pretty terrifying. Unfortunately, they then followed that 8 years later with Arethusa, which at 5,800 tons is armed with only 6 5-inch guns and 8 heavy SSMs. This appears to be... I've seen destroyers with very similar armaments, just maybe slightly less, but... And this is better AA than any destroyer, but like... This is not well armed enough to be a cruiser. It doesn't have enough guns. Missiles have not yet really superseded guns. It also doesn't actually have more missiles than some of the latest destroyers that I saw from like Germany. Okay, I think those are the only 2 destroyers in the world with that many, but still. This is too small, too underarmed for a modern light cruiser, especially as it's not even spectacularly fast. They are building a much larger 13,000 tons Sugetvar. Japan then has 17 light cruisers amounting to 163,000 tons, which is pretty good still, considering what a beating it took in the war. I guess its light cruisers came through a little better. They have 5 Akashis from about 1940, 10,000 tons, 12 6-inch and 16 4-inch guns, 4-inch armor belt, so not bad all around. Reasonably well armed, not spectacularly, but reasonably. And I like the 4-inch dual-purpose guns. The armor is pretty good. The speed is not that great, but it's not that terrible. So there's no major flaws with those. Unfortunately, they then built the Tenirus, which at 7,500 tons have only 16 5-inch guns, which basically makes them better in an AA role, not so good against other light cruisers. That said, they built 2 Tamas, which with 15 6-inch and 18 4-inch guns, plus 32 knots, at the sacrifice of some armor, are almost certainly more effective against other... and 12 above-water torpedo tubes. These 2 are quite nasty against any other light cruiser, actually. It's a shame they only have 2 of them, because these are pretty mean. I would definitely rather have that extra armament than the 2 inches of armor. Modern 6-inch guns will punch through... what? Modern 6-inch guns will penetrate the 4 inches of armor at anything within 7 or 8,000 yards, really. I mean, it's a difference maker from here to here. That's a significant potential immunity zone. But altogether speaking, I mean, fussing around with immunity zones is very hard, probably, to do in an actual battle, especially if it's not 1v1 between light cruisers. You'd probably rather have the armament and the speed. They then built 2 Hashidates, which are a bit smaller, but with 12 6-inch, 8 4-inch, 33 knots. Not heavily armored at all, but fast, reasonably well armed. Bit budget, but not bad. Pretty good choices made for going budget. Then Akitsushimi, presumably the only survivor of her class, 11,800 tons, 33 knots, 18 6-inch guns and 6 triple turrets, 23-inch, 2.5-inch belt, 6 above water torpedo tubes. Well, the 3-inch guns might be better for dual purpose use, but will be worse against other ships than the 4-inch would be. But overall, another pretty nice cruiser from Japan. They then built their first SSM cruiser, which is secretly an SSM very large destroyer with 6 5-inch guns and 3 heavy SSMs. I am fairly certain that there's quite a few destroyers in the world that are both faster than and smaller than and have more armament than this light cruiser. Less armor, yes, but it's not like she has any significant amount of armor. She has a lot of AA, relatively speaking. That's about all she's got. This thing is useless. Literally, a destroyer would have done its job better for cheaper. They then built 3 Yahagis, which with 9 6-inch guns, all forward, and 4 heavy SSMs, 35 knots, 10,300 tons. These are sort of entering the modern era where sacrificing a little bit on guns for enormous speed and a few missiles. The speed is going to be more and more necessary. I mean, a modern cruiser probably has to reach a speed a little like this because modern battle cruisers and such will reach 32 knots pretty easily, or heavy cruisers will. So light cruisers continue to get pushed faster and faster. Then they built a Tatsuda, which is... I don't know what the hell this is. Why is it 6,900 tons for a total armament of 6 5-inch guns? Okay. With 12 radar-guided medium AA guns, I guess it's fair to say this is probably an AA cruiser. However, it is built very recently. It doesn't have SAMs. And for a dedicated AA cruiser, I don't know if Japan has the fleet tonnage to be able to afford dedicated AA cruisers at the moment. And you'd really want to try to stuff SAMs onto one if you were building one. Italy then has 15 light cruisers amounting to 146,000 tons, which is pretty small for the size of their fleet. I mean, it's noticeably less than Japan. This is in part because 7 of them are the Quartos from 1940, which for 9,600 tons only managed to mount 14 5-inch guns. They're reasonably fast, reasonably some torpedo tubes, thin armor. I mean, like all the other 5-inch, I mean, they're very good against destroyers, I'm sure. Not so good against any heavy cruiser. And they followed that up with 3 Libyas, which on over 2,000 tons less have more armor, 2 more guns, and are what, a knot slower? Yeah. I'd probably rather have a Libya. Whether it probably wouldn't win an actual gunfight, but it's significantly cheaper. And anything with 5-inch guns like this built for destroyer killing has got to be as cheap as possible, really. So that you can invest in something a little more like this. The 5 Alberto de Giussianos, 11,300 tons, 32 knots, 12 6-inch, 16 dual-purpose 4-inch guns, 3-inch belt. I mean, this is a very formidable mainline light cruiser. It's not exceptional, but there's absolutely... I mean, it's just a good ship. All 5 of them. Unfortunately, those are the only 5. The other, 10? Yeah, the other 10 light cruisers in their fleet are barely even light cruisers. Now, France. France has 25 light cruisers amounting to 188,000 tons, which is actually the most hulls out of anyone in the world for light cruisers, and third most tonnage, just losing out to Britain. And they're building 4 more to boot. So let's see here. They have Davut from 39, 6.6-inch and 8.3-inch guns, 32 knots. I mean, it's rather small. At this point, 6.6-inch guns, you know, at least the things with 14 or 16 5-inch guns have an idea of what they are. This thing is just plain inadequate for pretty much any purpose. It's just a weird compromise design. It was less bad when it was built. There were a lot more cruisers with 8 or 9 6-inch guns around, but now that pretty much every mainline cruiser has 12 or 15 6-inch guns, this is not going to do it for that, and it's not going to do it for anti-destroyer duties either. Then 3 Lalondes with 16 5-inch guns. I mean, we get the idea. Good against destroyers. Not so good against anything that's not a destroyer. And then they built no less than 6 of these frigates, which appear to be pretty much a waste of steel. 5,300 tons, 32 knots, 10 5-inch guns, 2-inch belt. I mean, okay, these are even more of sort of a dedicated destroyer killer, but really, there are destroyers out there in the world with like 8 6-inch guns, which would just beat this ship, probably. Yes, it has armor that destroyers wouldn't, but not that much armor. At close range, one of those destroyers with 6-inch guns, or even a couple of destroyers with 8 5-inch guns, would probably wreck this ship, which is considerably more expensive than those destroyers. So they've compromised too far. The frigates are just not useful. You need to at least have these 16 5-inch guns or so if you're going to really try to kill destroyers. That being said, I'm noticing they have no ships with a decent armament so far. I mean, the Daasys with 16 5-inch guns will at least kill destroyers, but they then went straight back to a 4-ship the Entrecastot class with 10 5-inch guns, which will... I mean, it'll beat 1 destroyer, of course. 2 decent destroyers will give it a heck of a run for its money, honestly. The very newest, like our Warden class with autoloaders and SSMs, might actually be able to beat this ship just 1v1. To be fair, it's also only 1,900 tons lighter, but that's like a lot at this sort of displacements that we're talking about, percentage-wise. Then 4 Illinois with 6 6-inch and 4 3-inch guns, all dual purpose, still just hugely inadequate. Okay, yes, it has a couple of SSMs. That doesn't make up for the fact that it basically has a destroyer tier armament at this point in this world. Pretty sure I've seen destroyers with this exact armament, in point of fact. And it only does 31 knots to boot. Yeah, these 4 also just wastes. In fact, it appears the 2 Gushens that they built 5 years ago are pretty much their only things that are decent, you know, capable of fighting other light cruisers. 1,900 tons, 31 knots, 12 6-inch guns, 8 3-inch dual purpose, and 2 SSMs. This will at least fight other cruisers, although for being built only 5 years ago, it's not going to come out looking that impressive against other line cruisers from 5 years ago. But at least it's something. All the rest of their cruisers are horrifically underarmed and mostly way too small for what the standard in this world is. So the largest fleet by numbers in the world, got there by building a bunch of tiny, useless cruisers is what it comes down to. Now, Britain, 24 light cruisers amounting to 189,000 tons. Second most by hulls in the world, also second most by tonnage. I mean, they have a slightly better tonnage ratio than France. I'm still kind of prepared for a lot of really small cruisers here. Okay, we start off with Latona, the only surviving Canada from 1943. 9,800 tons, 31 knots, 15 6-inch and 12 4-inch dual-purpose guns, 6 torpedo tubes, and a 3-inch armor belt. Now, this Latona here is very formidable. A very nice gun armament, reasonable torpedo armament, reasonable armor belt. Not the greatest speed, but not horrible. Obviously, she doesn't have SSMs like she would if she were built 10 years later, or more even. Well, 10 years later would have done it. But she still holds up pretty nicely against a lot of the older cruisers in service. Unfortunately, they had followed her with 5 Polaris class with 10 5-inch guns, 32 knots. Again, these are the sort of anti-destroyer cruisers that have compromised so heavily that they can't even beat a lot of the destroyers they might be fighting. They then built 4 Arathusas, which with 16 5-inch guns can at least beat destroyers, but would almost certainly be wrecked by any decent, 12 6-inch gun light cruiser. And at 8,100 tons, they're much closer to a proper 6-inch gun light cruiser than they are to a destroyer. A fact which is even more glaring with the Palace class, which 16 5-inch guns are at least dual purpose, and 12 torpedo tubes to boot, so this is a proper sort of light torpedo cruiser, but it's 9,300 tons. It's not that light. It's really quite heavy and expensive. And it doesn't have the gunpowder to deal with other light cruisers. Then 5 Terpsichores with 14 5-inch guns, only 6 torpedo tubes, and only 30 knots, too. So at that point, it's really going to struggle. I mean, a lot of destroyers these days go like 35 knots. Yes, it has the armament to do a good job in an anti-destroyer role, but doesn't really have the speed. Worse than most of the others, And I mean, 9,600 tons? This is really the best you could do? Come on, Britain. And then, of course, they decided if they couldn't do it on 9,600 tons, they might as well not do it on 6,400 tons and built 2 Peaks with 6 6-inch guns, 4 3-inch guns, which, as we mentioned with the French versions of this, are pretty much useless against everything. Both good light cruisers and destroyers, and honestly, probably those 14 5-inch gun light cruisers would beat these in a fight. So what are you even doing? And then 3 Rainbows, which appear to be functionally pretty much identical. And then finally, 5 years ago, 2 Intrepids of 10,800 tons, 31 knots, 12 6-inch guns, and 4 triple mounts, 16 3-inch dual purpose, 2-inch belt, a couple of SSMs. Not sure this is better than Latona from all those years ago that's 1,000 tons lighter. But the SSMs, at least, indicate some modernization. The armament is not terrible, nor is the armor. This is the only light cruiser in Britain's fleet that I like. The others are all pretty bad for the most part. Even the Intrepids, for only being built 5 years ago, I expect more. It feels like it's not really better than Canada, even. Then Russia did not go so heavily into light cruisers. It has 18, amounting to 160, basically 1,000 tons. Similar to like Japan, basically. 6 of those are the Krasny Krims from about 1940, which with 15 5-inch and 6 4-inch dual-purpose guns, 33 knots, 3-inch belt, 6 above-water torpedo tubes. Look, they're 9,400 tons, which means they're really way too big and expensive for anti-destroyer purposes. But out of all the anti-destroyer ships we've done, these probably do about the best with good armor, excellent speed, good armament for the purpose. These tear destroyers up quite well. But again, 6-inch armed light cruisers would tear them up in turn. And they pretty much cost as much as those 6-inch armed light cruisers. So, and they then built 5 Tbilisis with 10 5-inch guns. I believe I've made my opinion on 5,000-ton ships with 10 5-inch guns as their only armament pretty clear at this point. Then 4 Orpheus with 9 6-inch guns, 8 3-inch, 8,400 tons, 32 knots. These are a little just 3 triple turrets. I mean, these are just distinctly on the small and weak side for what's around nowadays in terms of 6-inch cruisers. 12 or 15 guns is pretty common. But I'd still rather have this than one of those 5-inch armed ships, probably, so not terrible. And they then built Hersones with 12 6-inch, 8 4-inch, 33 knots, 2-inch belt. This is quite nice, actually, especially for getting it done on only 9,000 tons. So that's a good cruiser. And then 2 Mesembryas with 11,700 tons, 18 6-inch guns, and 6 triple turrets, 23-inch dual purpose, 33 knots, 2.5-inch belt. Well, these are proper, line cruisers with a really heavy armament, decent armor, excellent speed. So these are very good. The problem is only their 3 most recent cruisers are pretty good. I guess you could call it an alarming trend, especially as they're now building Baku of 12,000 tons. But all of these older ships are very bad for the most part, so they're going to have to build a lot more of the good ones before they become worrying. Then we have Germany with 17 light cruisers amounting to 181,000 tons, of which, sorry, that's only the 4th largest tonnage in the world, actually, for the 2nd largest fleet. They've prioritized more. Well, they have a larger capital ship force in service, which, to be fair, does make up for a lot. Anyway, they have 6 Aakins from about 1940 with 15 5-inch, 6 4-inch guns on 9,400 tons. It'll be good against destroyers, of course. It won't be good against other light cruisers. I don't understand why the AI builds so many light cruisers with 5-inch guns. And then 2 Lubecs with 14 5-inch guns, 33 knots, 2.5-inch belt. I mean, murder on destroyers. Not so much on other light cruisers. They then built 4 Stendals with 12 6-inch guns, 8 3-inch guns, 32 knots, 9,700 tons, 2-inch belt. I mean, this is much more like it, really. I don't have a problem with these. Good AA armament. Yep. Everybody packs a lot of mines onto their cruisers these days. I don't think I have that many on mine. But that's quite a nice design. And then, unfortunately, they went to the 4 Triers with 6 6-inch and 4 3-inch guns, 6,600 tons, 32 knots. Look, at least they're small and cheap, but they're also terrible, so why build them? And most recently, they've built the 6,000-ton Mains, which has exactly 4 5-inch guns, 4 SSMs, and 2 SAMs. So in fairness, this is what a budget SAM cruiser looks like. I decided it was impossible, more or less, at this moment, to build a SAM light cruiser without making unacceptable compromises. Well, this kind of confirms that for me, because let's be honest, it's extremely useless at anything except anti-air. Now, honestly, I suppose I probably have the budget to build dedicated anti-air cruisers. It's rather hard to guarantee they'd actually end up where you needed them, though, because you don't have exact control of your fleet, of course. Disposition-wise, even with the division system, you couldn't put them in a division. If you could define a carrier task group with a dedicated AA cruiser in it, that would be one thing, but you really can't. So I'm not too sure about building a light cruiser that is functional, It'll should be pretty good for AA, but it better hope that not so much as a destroyer gets near it, because most any destroyer will blow it out of the water pretty easily, surface to surface wise. And they're building 4 of them, which seems like more than they can afford. to dedicate to that anyway. Now, the U.S. has 20 light cruisers, with 10 more building. The 340,000 tons is for the total. Practically speaking, we maybe have, what's the tonnage on our new ones? 12,000. So subtract 120, we have about 220,000 tons of ships in service at the moment. That being a bit of a hodgepodge, actually, more than most of our other types. 7 Cincinnati's from about 1940. So pretty much the oldest age of the AI ships, too, at this point. 9,400 tons, 32 knots, 12 6-inch guns, 6 4-inch dual purpose, 2 triple torpedo tubes, 2-inch belt and deck. Overall, they still hold up reasonably well as line cruisers. They will make mincemeat out of any of those 5-inch gun designs the AI loves to build for some reason. But they're definitely increasingly obsolete. They don't have the latest, they don't have radar guided AA. Probably should have refit some more ships for that or something, but they don't have it. They're not terrible, but they are being replaced shortly, and for good reason. Then 3 San Franciscos from 1945. These 11,600 tons, 33 knots, 16 6-inch guns in. What are they in? I don't actually know how we got to exactly that figure, and I can't really tell from looking at the diagram. It's a little small. I think it must be, 4 triple and 2 twin mounts, probably, plus 8 4-inch dual purpose, plus 2 triple torpedo tubes, 2-inch belt, 2-inch deck. These are essentially along the same lines as the Cincinnati's, but with the extra 2,000 tons, they gain 4 guns, plus more secondaries, more AA, and more speed. So they're in every way more formidable. These will still pretty much slug it out with the best other light cruisers around, surface to surface. They're a little obsolete in that they don't have missiles or radar guided AA. But in a gunfight with pretty much anything out there, they're still very comfortable, or at least even odds. Now, since 1950, we've built 6 Raleighs and 4 Raleigh Block 2s, which are basically the same as a refit Raleigh. There's no functional difference at this point between them. We just can't build ships direct with the refit, and the refit that happened to equip them with missiles was pretty fundamental. So the Raleigh's 12,000 tons, 33 knots, 16 6-inch guns in, I believe, 4 triple, 2 twin turrets, sounds right. 10 3-inch dual purpose, 8 radar guided AA guns, 2 triple torpedo tubes, 2-inch belt, 2-inch deck, 4 heavy SSMs. These are obviously a direct descendant of the San Franciscos. In essence, they swapped their 4-inch guns for 3-inch dual purpose. They gained radar guided AA, and ultimately they gained SSMs as well. So these are currently. I didn't really see any AI light cruiser that I don't think these could beat. There were a couple with 18 6-inch guns, which technically outgun them. I think that none of those had SSMs, which could potentially be a big factor swinging in our favor. There's a pretty high chance that we have better radar and such than them. Hard to say if they have 2-inch type decks. We're faster than most of them. I'm still very happy with the Raleigh class after just looking through all the AI has. These are quite nice overall. That being said, we are building 10 of the new Galveston class, not so much to replace the Raleighs as to replace the Cincinnati's and San Franciscos. The Galvestons are really pretty much identical, which is part of why. But 12,000 tons, 33 knots, 16 6-inch guns, 10 3-inch 8AA. Look, the only functional difference really between the Raleighs and the Galvestons is that the Galvestons managed to equip 8 heavy SSMs rather than 4. So it's just a straight upgrade using the best modern tech. And I think maybe they have spacious quarters as well. Maybe not. I might have neglected that. But the Galvestons are basically just a modernization of the Raleighs. And pretty shortly, we'll have a fleet of 20 light cruisers, which are all SSM equipped, which will be hugely superior to anything else in existence at the moment. All right. I will come back in the morning with heavy cruisers. Right. Ignore it being 12 hours later. We move on to heavy cruisers. Spain continues to be highly dependent on heavy cruisers, actually, with 17 of them in service, amounting to 298,000 tons, which is the third most in the world by tonnage. And tied third most by numbers, actually. Of course, there is the fact that they have absolutely no heavier surface ships than their heavy cruisers, which is a bit of a limitation, but nonetheless, they got a lot of them. Starting with Isabel II from way back in 38, 13,500 tons, 32 knots, 8 8-inch guns in 4 twin turrets, 12 4-inch, 3.5-inch belt. Fast enough. Not really well enough. I mean, a standard real-world heavy cruiser armament, and not so bad in 38, but in this world, there's a lot of heavy cruisers running around with 9-inch guns, even 10-inch guns. So Isabel II still isn't terrible, but she's definitely undergunned, especially when they immediately followed with 4 Principe Alfonsos, which on 200 tons less managed to have 10 8-inch guns, albeit only 16 3-inch guns, which is definitely a weaker secondary armament. Better armor belt as well, though, so this is just probably a better design. They might have made some compromises, though. Hard to say. Then 4 Inizares class from the mid-40s. 14,900 tons, 32 knots, 12 10-inch guns in 4 triple turrets, 16 5-inch dual-purpose, and a 3-inch belt. They haven't modernized the AA, I noticed, but I mean, again, quite fast, extremely well armed, not so well armored, but I mean, it's big and it's expensive and it's still hopeless against a battle cruiser, but it's definitely a menace against other heavy cruisers, so not such a bad choice. And then they built 4 La Carolinas of 14,600 tons, 33 knots, 9 10-inch guns in 3 triple turrets, 16 3-inch dual-purpose, 5.5-inch belt. So this sacrifices one of the 10-inch turrets for more speed and quite a bit more armor, which is not necessarily a bad choice. I don't know that it would actually be better, but I'm not prepared to say that it's straightforwardly worse. And it's definitely still quite formidable against most of the other heavy cruisers out there in the world in the gunfight, at the very least. And they built 4 of them, which is not a small number necessarily. And most recently, 4 Selanovas of 16,400 tons, 31 knots, 12 10-inch guns, 4 triple turrets, 16 3-inch, 5-inch belt, and 4 SSMs. And again, I can't really point to the obvious flaws of this ship. It's very well armed. Not too fast, but not horrible. Reasonable armor. It's even got SSMs, so I'm actually pretty impressed by Spain's heavy cruiser lineup. Now, obviously, the most glaring flaw is that they don't have anything heavier than these heavy cruisers. But they've got a lot of 10-inch gunned heavy cruisers. I mean, 12 of them with 9 or 12 10-inch guns, all with reasonable armor, reasonable speed, The latest ones even have SSMs. Spain's heavy cruiser force is doing very well. It's just a shame that that's the peak of their fleet, effectively. But I understand why they have so much tonnage now. Austria-Hungary also has 17 heavy cruisers, amounting to 299,000 tons. That is actually the second most tonnage in the world, while tied third for numbers. But as with Spain, they have no larger ships whatsoever. They have 4 of the old Budweis class from the late 30s, 14,400 tons, 32 knots, 12 10-inch guns, and 4 triple turrets, 16 5-inch dual purpose, and a 4-inch belt. Modernized AA as well. I mean, again, very well armed, solid speed. Armor is maybe a little thinner than most of the Spanish ships, but not terrible. I'm guessing the Spanish and Austro-Hungarians both are probably using like short range, maybe cramped or other low freeboard. It's hard to say, but their ships hardly ever have to operate outside the Mediterranean, so they may have made a lot of compromises on them that way. But that being said, in the Mediterranean, they'll be extremely dangerous, and I can't prove that that's what they've done, so it's possible they'll be dangerous anywhere. They then followed that with 3 Carlsbad class, which 12 8-inch guns and 4 triple turrets, 32 knots, 16 5-inch dual purpose, 4-inch belt. I mean, actually, it's not that good in the sense that it's literally 100 tons less than Budweis and pretty identical except for dropping all of its guns from 10 to 8 inches. I mean, I wonder if that is sort of the proof of what I just said and that maybe this cruiser actually doesn't have short range and so on. It's still not terrible, but it's much less impressive on the basis of these stats than Budweis. It might be much more able to operate in long range, though. They then built a couple of Schwarzenbergs, 12,900 tons, 32 knots, 10 8-inch guns, 16 3-inch dual purpose, and a 4-inch armor belt. I mean, these are noticeably smaller and verging on sort of underarmed for this universe's heavy cruisers, but still not a terrible design. Just not terrifying either. Then 4 Agers from the late 40s, 14,300 tons, 31 knots, 12 8-inch guns, and 4 triple turrets, 16 5-inch, 4.5-inch belt. 31 knots isn't that great. Armor is still alright, though. Armament is alright, not spectacular. 8-inch guns are just a little passe for this world's heavy cruisers, shall we say, but it's still a dangerous and functional heavy cruiser for sure. I'm actually surprised how little the AI is screwing these up so far. Then, in this decade, they've built 3 Sankt George class, 12,600 tons, 31 knots, 9 8-inch guns in 3 triple turrets, 12 3-inch dual purpose, 6-inch belt, 4 SSMs. So they've basically dropped an 8-inch turret in order to get SSMs on, and a lot thicker armor as well. And on a pretty affordable displacement. The question is whether those 4 SSMs are worth an entire 8-inch turret. I'm not totally convinced necessarily that they are. But not in 1960 anyway. But maybe they are. In future, if they can get tech upgrades, they will be. The armor is quite impressive as well. So I wouldn't say this is terrible, more that it's just sort of unproven whether tech is actually there to make it work or not. Then they built, so far, a one-off, Rob. And it is a one-off, yeah. They're now building 4 Skiddens. But Rob is 15,800 tons, 33 knots, 9 9-inch guns and 3 triple turrets, 14 3-inch dual purpose, 5-inch belt, 4 SSMs, and 3 SAM launchers. This is basically identical or very similar to what I'm building in terms of heavy cruisers now, with sacrificing basically what would be a 9-inch turret in order to get SAMs and SSMs in. Maintains a good speed, reasonable armor. This is, I think, a very sound sort of AA heavy cruiser design. Obviously, there are going to be heavy cruisers with more gun power than it, but it does have the SSMs and the SAMs to sort of make up for that in terms of overall usefulness in what's steadily becoming a more aircraft-dominated environment. So I think this is a fairly solid design as well. Now, Japan once had quite a few heavy cruisers, although I don't think it was ever heavy cruiser focused. But post-war with us has not at all recovered, and currently has 7 heavy cruisers amounting to 139,000 tons, which is easily the least out of anyone in the world on both counts. They have, especially painful probably, is that out of the survivors, 4 out of the 7 are Haguros from the late 30s, which are certainly outdated by now. 13,300 tons, 32 knots, 10 8-inch guns in 2 twin, 2 triple turrets, 16 3-inch dual purpose, 4.5-inch belt. It's not that these were terrible when they were conceived, nor are they necessarily terrible even now. They have a reasonable speed, reasonable if not great armor, and a reasonable but not great armament. But they obviously don't really have any of the modern innovations except that they've modernized their AA, and their gun power is basically mediocre in this world. So there's nothing at all impressive about the Hakuros. They're just bang below average. Not standout. Then they have one Suzuya from 1941, 13,900 tons, 31 knots, 12 8-inch guns in 4 triple turrets, 16 5-inch dual purpose, 4.5-inch belt. I mean, slightly heavier armament, but it loses a knot of speed to do it, which is obviously worth it in a slugging match against another heavy cruiser. Might not really be worth it overall. They're still only 8-inch guns. And they add 600 tons as well. They do have a much heavier secondary armament as well, though, the 5-inch rather than 3-inch. So I would say this is a better design, but I would have really liked to get that extra knot on it myself. But Suzuya is at least solid. And then they have 2 Takiwas, which they've built post-war. So they only had 5 cruisers that survived the war. Maybe they scrapped 1 or 2, but they've built 2 cruisers post-war. The Takiwas, 14,400 tons, 31 knots, 6 10-inch guns in 2 triple turrets, 14 5-inch dual purpose, 5-inch belt, and 4 SSMs. Honestly, for being 14,500 tons, only having 2 triple turrets isn't so great, even if they are only 10-inch. Plus, unlike what the Austrians and myself are doing, they haven't actually gotten SAMs on here, at least according to our intelligence. Although those are big. Those look like they could be SAM sites, but no, they're helicopter pads, probably. You know what? But yeah, to lose, they don't even have SAMs, so I'm not really clear on why they had to sacrifice a whole turret. I think they're just economizing on tonnage, but the result is a pretty unimpressive ship. Only 6 guns. The 4 SSMs definitely don't make up for that on their own, I don't think. They don't have any SAMs, apparently. The speed is not too impressive. The armor's alright, so yeah, Japan's heavy cruiser force is severely battered, and the rebuilding process doesn't look too impressive so far. France, then, has 18 heavy cruisers, amounting to 265,700 tons. That's the second most heavy cruisers by number, but only 4th most by tonnage, so they're going to be a little smaller on average than Spain and Austria-Hungary's. Now, it is worth noting that there are another of those powers with no ships larger than a heavy cruiser. Japan only has 1 mined after the war, but at least philosophically they're trying. Everybody else has a fair number still. So France, the oldest four from the late 30s are the Kleber class, 13,600 tons, 32 knots, 8-inch, 12 4-inch dual purpose. Looks like 4 twin turrets, 5-inch belt. I mean, a thoroughly just unexceptional below average heavy cruiser. Speed is good, armor is good, armament is just very much below average to the point of being there's not very many heavy cruisers in the world that this thing would actually expect to beat in a one-on-one fight. So definitely a bit obsolescent. Then 5 Sully class from the early 40s, 14,700 tons, 32 knots, 12 10-inch guns in 4 triple turrets, 16 5-inch dual purpose, 3.5-inch belt. Well, speed is good. Armament obviously very impressive. They have sacrificed a noticeable amount of armor for it, but I'm still pretty confident it would dispatch a Clipper pretty handily. That being said, it's definitely a weakness, but it is a very impressive gun armament. And it's not on that. I mean, it's a very expensive ship, no doubt, but the displacement is not too ridiculous. I definitely have a lot of much heavier heavy cruisers that are not better armed running around, so the AI does do a pretty good job mostly of squeezing these 10-inch guns on. They then built the one-off Colbert, 14,700 tons, 30 knots, 12 8-inch, 16 5-inch dual purpose, 3.5-inch belt. Okay. It's a good thing for them that this was a one-off because it's too slow, the armor's too thin, and its armament is mediocre at best. And all for literally the same displacement as a Sully. I'm guessing they sacrificed all that maybe to get just these float planes on? That's not even close to worth it, surely. I can't believe that that'd be worth it. 2 knots of speed? 2 inches of gun caliber for 2 float planes? I don't think so. There must be other things as well. Maybe these are even... Well, I wouldn't think. I mean, they're scattered all over the world. If they are short range, then they'll be catastrophically hamstrung in a war. I doubt they are. Maybe there's some other compromise, cramped or something, but... Yeah, Colbert looks very unimpressive next to the Sullys. Then 4 Edgar Quinets, 13,100 tons, 31 knots, 8 9-inch guns in 4 twin turrets, 12 5-inch dual purpose, 4-inch belt, and a couple of float planes. Well, it's better than Colbert, but still not that fast. Not terrible, but not that fast. Armor, a little below average. Armament, acceptable, better than 8-inch guns, but not spectacular in this world either. It's got torpedo tubes above water. I don't know. These are passable at best. They're not great by any means. And then in the early, basically in this decade, they've built 4 Tourvilles, 14,800 tons, 31 knots, 12 8-inch guns in 4 triple turrets, 16 3-inch, 5-inch belt, 4 SSMs. Speed's a bit mediocre, armor's good. Armament is mediocre, but kind of acceptable, considering they have managed to stuff SSMs on as well. Still, I'm not overly impressed. This is sort of average to below average for a modern cruiser, which makes it probably better than the average to below average cruisers of 10 or 20 years ago, but still not that great, you know? It's not exactly pouring anything super fancy. I mean, it's got 4 SSMs. There's a ton of destroyers out there that have that as well, so it's hard to say it's making full use of new tech. And they're building a pretty small heavy cruiser now, so we'll see what they put onto that. After that, we have Britain, which has 15 heavy cruisers amounting to 212,000 tons. A relatively light cruiser force for the size of its fleet. However, it does have larger ships in service as well. The oldest two are the Hampshires from 38, 13,900 tons, 31 knots, 9 10-inch guns, and 3 triple turrets, 3.5-inch belt. Well, armor is pretty weak. Speed is not great. The armament is obviously fairly heavy, but there's definitely, I've seen numerous better 10-inch armed cruisers around. With the caveat that some of those might be short-ranged or something, so I don't know if I'm prepared to call this. This isn't awful, but it's definitely below average. I'm not too impressed by the Hampshires. And they then followed that with Donegal, which appears to have sacrificed a knot of speed for a lot more armor. And, to be fair, although this is pretty slow for a heavy cruiser, it's really only by a knot or two, which isn't necessarily a big deal. Well, it'll struggle to keep up, it'll limit the speed of their other heavy cruiser formations. So you really wouldn't want to do it, but the difference is probably less likely to be significant than the extra armor is, in my judgment, honestly. So I'd probably rather have a Donegal. I think that's not too bad. They then built 4 Berwicks in the mid to late 40s, 13,600 tons, 31 knots, 8 8-inch guns, 4 twin turrets, 12 4-inch, and 4-inch belt. I mean, this one is just very all around below average speed, below average armor, below average armament. There's nothing horrible about it, but there's nothing good about it either, really. It's just unimpressive, kind of obsolescent. Then 2 Roxburghs, 13,100 tons, 31 knots, 8 8-inch guns, and 4 twin turrets, 14 4-inch dual purpose, 4.5-inch belt. I mean, much the same, really, as the Berwicks. 500 tons lighter, and it carries 2 more. It's better. 500 tons lighter, and it carries 2 more dual-purpose guns, plus a half-inch extra of belt armor. But it doesn't really change the fundamentals of armament speed. Just not impressive. Then in this decade, they've built 5 of the Sutledge class. 14,800 tons, 32 knots, 12 8-inch guns, and 4 triple turrets, 16 3-inch dual-purpose, 5.5-inch belt, and 4 SSMs to boot. So speed is good, armor is quite nice. Armament is not outstanding, but is pretty respectable. And they've crammed some SSMs on as well. So obviously this is sort of the modern, not a SAM cruiser look at the moment. And it's not bad. It would probably beat my new SAM cruisers in a straight-up fight, even though the armament is slightly lower caliber. But on the other hand, it'll provide less overall value to the fleet against aircraft and the like, especially in fleets that do have heavier capital units available still. But it's not terrible. Definitely not. And most recently, they've built the 16,000-ton Monmouth, 31 knots, 7 10-inch guns, and what appears to be 1 quad and 1 triple turret, which is a really weird choice, but okay. 8 5-inch dual purpose, 8 SSMs, 2 SAMs, and a 6.5-inch belt. I'd love for an extra knot of speed, but I mean, the armament probably about equivalent to the sort of 9 9-inch that some other people have put onto their SAM cruisers. Very good armor, and a very heavy missile loadout for the modern days, for 1960 that is. So, obviously big and expensive, but yeah, I'm pretty impressed by Monmouth. Quite a formidable modern SAM cruiser design, in essence. It's a lot of belt armor, especially, although hard to say what the deck might be. And, the full loadout of missiles and everything could be faster, but it's not bad. Now, Russia has gone harder into heavy cruisers than everyone else by a fair margin. They have both the most heavy cruisers and the most tonnage of heavy cruisers by near 75,000 ton margin over Spain and Austria-Hungary, and a 4-ship margin over France. The oldest, and they still have a significant surface fleet as well. Pretty much 6, 5, second largest in the world. Yeah. So the oldest is the Maxim Gorky from 38, 14,900 tons, 30 knots, 12 10-inch guns, and 4 triple turrets, 16 5-inch dual-purpose, 3-inch belt. Obviously a very impressive armament, but her speed and her armor are both quite underwhelming, which sort of marks her out as noticeably a bit obsolescent in the modern era. Bit of a glass cannon and not that fast either, but that's still a lot of gun barrels. Large gun barrels for a heavy cruiser. Then 3 Molotov class, 14,200 tons, 31 knots, 12 10-inch guns in 4 triple turrets, 16 5-inch dual purpose, 4-inch belt. Well, this sort of partially corrects the faults of Maxim Gorky. A knot faster, an extra inch of belt armor, same armament, so pretty much just better in every way. Still not, a bit below average in speed and armor, but not as cripplingly so. So this is a lot scarier as a class, and for 700 tons less, too. Although considering it's the same year, I really wonder what kind of other compromises they made to get this, but on paper, at least, it looks a lot more formidable. Then 2 Azovs, which 14,500 tons, 33 knots, 9 8-inch guns, and 3 triple turrets, 16 3-inch dual-purpose, 4-inch belt. Look, these are very fast, but considering how much tonnage they've got, the fact they've only got 9 8-inch guns and below-average armor as well, I'm not sure that extra speed is really worth that much sacrifice to the armament and armor. I think almost any heavy cruiser in the world would beat these in a gunfight, which isn't so impressive. They followed that by building no less than 6 of the Vladivostok class, 14,200 tons, 31 knots, 12 8-inch guns, and 4 triple turrets, 16 5-inch dual-purpose, 4.5-inch belt. I mean, these again, they've got a lot of them, but they're kind of just armor is average to mediocre, speed is average to mediocre, armament is average to mediocre. There's nothing really great about the Vladivostoks at all. There's nothing horrible, but just an average sort of cruiser. And after the Vladivostoks, so yeah, those are just below average. They then built 4 Admiral Makarovs of 15,200 tons, 32 knots, 12 10-inch guns, and 4 triple turrets, 16 5-inch dual purpose, and a 3-inch belt. Oh, so close. These are fast. They're extremely well armed. But again, they're a bit of a glass cannon approach. Their armor is basically light cruiser grade instead of heavy cruiser grade. And it's a pretty heavy displacement, too. I mean, still mine are heavier, but, yeah. That armor really lets this down a little. But it's still very, very well armed and fairly fast, so you can't exactly count it out. Then they built 3 Vasily Chapayevs, 14,900 tons, 32 knots, 9 10-inch guns, and 3 triple turrets, 14 6-inch, and a 6-inch belt. So I guess the question then immediately becomes, would I rather have a Vasily Chapayev or an Admiral Makarov? Basically, they've dropped a turret and 300 tons of displacement in order to get an extra 3 inches of armor. I'm not sure. It's a bit of a toss-up. If I were designing it for myself, I'd probably just build one with 12 10-inch guns and 6 inches of belt armor, which is why my ships are so damn heavy on average. Honestly, I might have Vasily Chapayev. I mean, let's look at the 10-inch gun penetration stats. Look, a 10-inch gun penetrates 3 inches of belt armor at pretty much any range. Like, the maximum range of the gun is 21,000 yards. It can penetrate a 3-inch belt right out to that range. It has to be within 12,000 yards, basically, to penetrate 6 inches. So that's a 9,000 yard immunity zone. Depending on deck, which we can't really see, but I think I probably would take a Vasily Chapayev, because as long as it stayed at long range, its armor advantage over the Admiral Makarovs is so large that it really doesn't matter that the Makarovs have an extra turret. The Chapayevs would just be able to pummel it with near impunity. So I would say this is the better class, yeah. Naturally, in the modern era, they then built 2 Fanagorias of 20,000 tons, 32 knots, 16 10-inch guns in 4 quad turrets, 24 3-inch dual purpose, 7-inch belt, and 4 SSM launchers. Okay, well, look. Yes, this is the best heavy cruiser in the world. Clearly, by a lot. It's got speed, plenty of it, not exceptional, but good. It's got, I'm pretty sure, the thickest armor I've seen on any heavy cruiser. It's got the heaviest armament I've seen on any heavy cruiser. It's got SSMs to boot, just for that little spark of modernity. However, it also displaces 20,000 tons, which means it's extremely expensive. And it would still be destroyed by any self-respecting battlecruiser out there. So, is it worth it? I don't know. But it's a very, very dangerous heavy cruiser. It will kill pretty much any heavy cruiser out there, more or less with ease. But it's very expensive. And they only have 2 of them. They then went back down to Inkerman, which had 13,000 tons, 33 knots, 9 8-inch guns and 3 triple turrets, 12 3-inch dual-purpose, 4.5-inch belt, 4 SSMs, is a much more budget design, and this is sort of just fast, but below average armament, mediocre, but all right armor, but mediocre. And the fact that it has SSMs doesn't really make up for the fact that it's otherwise pretty mediocre, just fast. Overall, I mean, Russia's got a lot of heavy cruisers. A lot of them are quite well armed, although some of them aren't. It's a pretty dangerous force, especially the likes of the... Well, the Fanagorias are terrifying, but they're also super expensive, and then they have 2 of them. Most of their cruisers, honestly, are kind of flawed in some way, but they definitely have some very dangerous ships there. So from there, we move on to Germany, which has 14 heavy cruisers amounting to 207,000 tons. It is fascinating that the 2 biggest navies in the world right now, Germany and the US, have some of the least heavy cruisers, but they do have some of the most carriers and other surface gun capital ships. So apparently for the minor powers do a lot of heavy cruisers because they need them. The big boys apparently are still using bigger ships. But anyway, 14 of them amounting to 207,000 tons. More than Italy or Japan. Did I skip Italy? Huh. I think I did. Let's go back to Italy. 11 light heavy cruisers amounting to 215,000 tons. Not a whole lot compared to their Mediterranean neighbors. 2 San Marcos from the late 30s, 13,700 tons, 32 knots, 8-inch guns, 4-inch belt. I mean, fast enough. Armor and armament, just unimpressive. It's a below average, kind of obsolescent heavy cruiser, but it's not deeply flawed or anything. They then built 2 San Justos, which are 200 tons lighter and otherwise pretty much the same. Then 4 Fiumes in the late 40s, 13,400 tons, 33 knots, 9 8-inch guns, 16 3-inch dual purpose, 4-inch belt, I mean, fast, but again, pretty much definitely below average in armor and armament, so not that. Less excuse than the San Marcos and San Justos, honestly, because of how recently they were built. Not that impressive. And finally, 3 Carlo Albertos, 13,200 tons, 31 knots, 10 8-inch guns, 4.5-inch belt, 16 3-inch guns. Dual purpose. Below average speed, average to below average armor, below average to average armament. Honestly, there's a reason we skipped Italy, I guess. There's nothing really at all impressive in any of their heavy cruiser force. They've clearly sacrificed it in order to build these 5 battle cruisers, which we'll get to in a little bit. But what's left of their heavy cruiser force is nothing special at all. It's pretty much there to fill out the numbers. Anyway, so back to Germany. Their oldest heavy cruiser is Rostock from 39, 14,000 tons, 31 knots, 9 10-inch guns and 3 triple turrets, 16 3-inch dual purpose, and a 5.5-inch belt. Speed's just at a little bit below average, but armor is good. Armament is fairly impressive. So I don't have a big problem with this. This is just maybe shows its age a little in terms of its speed, in terms of having, well, the armament is really still pretty good, so this is still a very solid ship even 20 years after it was built. Obviously, it doesn't have the latest missiles or anything, but most of the world's fleets still aren't using missiles on their heavy cruisers, so there's really only a couple per fleet with them at the moment. So that can't be held against her too much. They then built 5 Regensburgs, 13,200 tons, 32 knots, 8 8-inch guns and 4 twin turrets, 12 4-inch dual purpose, and a 4-inch belt. Look, their speed is fine. Their armor and their armament are both solidly below average to the point that, they're just clearly obsolete. They still aren't that bad, but there's plenty of heavy cruisers around that would wipe the floor with them. I wouldn't build them now by any means. I probably wouldn't have built them in 1940 either. They then followed that with 5 Erfurts, which are pretty much the same damn thing. In fact, same displacement. 8 8-inch, 12 4-inch, 4-inch belt, 32 knots. In point of fact, I can't even tell what's different between them. There must be something, but it's not something that's shown on this stats sheet, at all. Basically, this is just a Regensburg repeat of 5 more of them. It wasn't until the late 40s that they built the 2 Scharnhorsts, which at 14,000 tons, 32 knots, 9 10-inch guns and 3 triple turrets, 16 4-inch dual purpose, 5.5-inch belt. These are quite a bit more impressive again. Fast, well armored, pretty well armed. Not, spectacular overkill heavy cruisers, but probably a very sensible, good heavy cruiser for the modern era. These are quite nice. It's a shame they only have 2 of them. And they then followed that with the one-off Passau, 16,300 tons, 30 knots, 10 10-inch guns in 2 twin, 2 triple turrets, 22 4-inch dual purpose, 5.5-inch belt, 4 SSMs. Look, it's well armed. It's well armored. It's very well armed. Especially, the guns and the SSMs between it. Very well armed. Speed is a little lacking. And, of course, it's very heavy and expensive, so you would expect all that from it. But, it's quite a nice ship, but the speed is a little lacking. A lot of other smaller heavy cruisers will be able to run away from it. So that might limit its value a little bit. It's definitely not bad, though. And they're currently building the even heavier Nuremberg, which looks like it's going to be a SAM cruiser design. But we can't see the details yet. Oh, we actually can, because we must have stolen intel on it. Well, 16,900 tons, 32 knots, 12 8-inch in 4 triple turrets, 10 5-inch dual purpose, 7-inch belt, 8 SSMs, 2 SAMs. I mean, yeah, it is indeed a heavy SAM cruiser. Interesting, they have chosen not to sacrifice turrets, but just to go down to 8-inch gun caliber. Whether that's the right call or not, I really can't say, honestly. But it's got good speed, it's got very good armor. It's got the full loadout of SSMs and SAMs, so it looks pretty dangerous to me. Not bad at all. And finally, that brings us to the USA, which has 10 heavy cruisers amounting to 198,000 tons, which is actually the smallest force in the world with the exception of war-ravaged Japan. All of those 10 at this moment, no. Oh, yes, actually, that's a museum ship. All of those 10 at this moment are the Charlotte class from the early to mid 40s. 16,300 tons, 32 nuts, 12 9-inch guns in 4 triple turrets, 16 5-inch dual purpose, 5-inch belt, 2.5-inch deck, and a couple of float planes to boot. These are very solid still, I would say. Their speed is good. Their armor is not extravagant, but good. And their armament is quite nice. Obviously, there are some 10-inch armed cruisers out there that will beat them, but they will beat the vast majority of 8-inch armed cruisers. They'll pretty much beat all the 8-inch armed cruisers. Interesting, the AI has pretty much just does 8 and 10-inch. There's not a lot of 9-inch out there. But I think 9-inch is probably a pretty good compromise for heavy cruisers. I guess the major issue is and always has been how heavy they are. I'm not quite sure why they're so much heavier than AI designs with similar capabilities. By a couple thousand tons in a lot of cases. All I can think is that the AI really doesn't go for, like, long... Well, but these don't even have long range. They have normal range, but that the AI saves tonnage by cramped accommodations or something, which I don't. But the Charlottes are still very capable all around. Nothing wrong with them at all. Obviously, they don't have SSMs or anything, but that is why we are planning to replace them in future with the Pueblo class, of which the first 2 are building. 17,800 tons, 32 knots, 9 9-inch guns in 3 triple turrets, 12 5-inch dual purpose, 5-inch belt, 2-inch deck, 4 SSMs, 2 SAMs, and a helicopter. Now, when I designed these, I thought they were pretty good, and I still don't think they're terrible. But I am actually, the couple of AI SAM designs I've seen have A, squeezed down a lot more SSMs, and B, have managed to get a lot more armor as well. So I'm curious how exactly they've done that, especially as a lot of them are still on less displacement than me. My gun armament is still pretty formidable, though, which a lot of the AI have maybe cut more than that. The helicopter costs a lot of weight, too, but I think maybe that's worth having. Especially if we're talking anti-submarine type duties becoming more and more important. Overall, I think the Pueblos will stand up reasonably well. It might be worth trying to find a way to sneak 4 more SSMs on as well, but I think they'll be alright for the next generation of heavy cruisers at least. Now the surface capital ships. Spain and Austria both have 0 surface capital ships. None whatsoever. Japan has exactly 1 following the end of the war, which was built post-war. A 40,200-ton battle cruiser with 31 knot speed, 9 16-inch guns and 3 triple turrets, 14 5-inch dual purpose, and an 11-inch belt, plus 8 SSMs. Well, the SSMs are a nice addition, but her speed is not that great. Her armor is not that great, although not terrible, because I've seen much worse armored battle cruisers, but not spectacular. Her armament is not spectacular either. There's nothing exactly wrong with her, but against one of the more modern American battle cruisers, even against one of the older American battle cruisers like United States, pretty clearly, I would say, I mean, same main gun armament, but less speed and armor. And the more modern American battlecruisers would very clearly beat her. On the other hand, she's not terrible or anything. Definitely still a dangerous capital ship combatant, and the SSMs give her a little extra something, which probably hardly any other capital ships in the world have, honestly. There haven't been that many built in the last decade. Now, Italy actually has the world's largest battlecruiser force with 5 Cristoforo Colombos built within the last 5 years. 57,500 tons, 32 knots, 10 in 2 triple and 1 quad turret, 16 5-inch and 24 3-inch dual purpose, 11.5-inch belt, 8 SSMs. Yeah, these are very formidable ships. They have a very nice armament for a battlecruiser, both the main armament and a very impressive array of dual-purpose guns. Their armor is not spectacular, but it's good. The half-inch is unlikely to make a big difference compared to, like, my ships. And they've got SSMs, so all around a very dangerous battlecruiser design. The gun arrangement is a little wonky, but that's kind of a minor flaw. Honestly, these are quite dangerous ships. Of course, they're 57,000 tons, and I don't know how Italy paid for these, partially by hamstringing its cruiser fleets, as it's only got a handful of good modern light cruisers and pretty much no good modern heavy cruisers, and honestly, it doesn't have very many carriers either. So they've put way too much of their budget probably really into these. But they have gotten some results. Cristoforo Colombo, Claudio Tiberio, Ottaviano Augusto, Attilio Regolo, and Francisco Morosini are probably 5 of the most dangerous surface capital ships in the world right now. And there's something to be said for that. France also has 0 gun capital units. Britain has 3, which consist of the battleship Magnificent from 1945, 64,300 tons, 28 knots, 12 16-inch guns in 4 triple turrets, 25-inch dual purpose, 8 3-inch dual purpose, and a 13-inch belt. Honestly, for being 64,000 tons, her speed is good. Definitely a fast battleship. And yeah, it's actually faster than any I have, so her speed is quite impressive, really. If I were building a battleship right now, it would probably be even faster, but her speed is good. Her armament is good. Her armor is maybe a little bit of a letdown compared to even a Pennsylvania has a 14-inch belt. My Vermonts also have 14-inch belts, but 6-inch decks. Now, it kind of depends how thick her deck is as well, but I mean, this is a very dangerous capital ship. I'm not too sure about her armor, and there's only one of her, but she's definitely a powerful ship. And then most recently, they've built the 2 Indomitable class battlecruisers, 44,700 tons, 31 knots, 8 16-inch guns and 4 twin turrets, 14 5-inch and 24 3-inch dual purpose, and a 10.5-inch belt. Honestly, for how late in the day they were built, the fact they don't have any SSMs is a little weird and disappointing. Their speed isn't that great. Their armament isn't that great. It's good, but not that great. They've got at least, a barrel less than a lot of modern battlecruisers. And their armor, I can only hope their deck is better, but their belt armor is not too impressive at all. So, not too I feel like Britain is continuing its pattern of under-armoring its ships a little bit here, just all around. The Indomitables are just a bit below average, not quite what I would hope for from a battlecruiser built in 1950 and 54. Then Russia actually has one of the world's largest capital ship forces with 2 battleships, 81,000 tons, and 4 battlecruisers for 200,000 tons. The battleships being pretty old, to be fair. Marat from 1936, 36,900 tons, 23 knots, 9 16-inch guns, 14 6-inch, 10 3-inch dual purpose, and a 13.5-inch belt. Yeah, I'm not too sold on this, really. I mean, the armament is still alright, especially for her displacement. She's rather slow for a battleship that's still in service. I mean, I have some that are almost as slow, but it's definitely starting to be a problem in 1960. Her armor is good, but not great. Yeah, you can't help but feel Murad is showing her age pretty substantially at this point. And then they have Sverdlov, which at 44,200 tons, 31 knots, 8 17-inch guns, and 2 quad turrets and a 12.5-inch belt, is pretty much a battlecruiser. This is one of the fastest battleships I've ever seen, if it's not a battlecruiser. And its armor is weak enough that it could easily be a battlecruiser. And the 2 quad forward turrets, I mean, if I just judge this as a battlecruiser, it's pretty damn good. Could probably use even more speed, but it's pretty damn good. As a battleship, well, there's a lot of ships with 12 16-inch barrels out there, which would almost certainly beat 8 17-inch, and have significantly more armor to boot, albeit at the cost of a lot of speed, but look, it's either a really fast but otherwise poor battleship, or it's a slightly slow but pretty damn dangerous battlecruiser. I would try to use it as a battlecruiser if I were them. That said, they've built in the last couple of years 4 Sevastopol-class battlecruisers: Sevastopol, Komintern, Frunz, and Tallinn. 50,100 tons, 33 knots, 9 16-inch guns in 3 twin and 1 triple turret. That's a really weird choice, okay. 22 4-inch dual purpose, 11-inch belt, and 8 SSMs. It's very fast. Its armor is a little weak, but not horrific. The armament is enough barrels, but it's really strange to choose 3 twin, 1 triple turret. There's nothing that bad about just going with 3 triple turrets. The SSMs are good, though, so this is a dangerous ship for sure. The armament layout does just baffle me a little, but with the SSMs, with the speed, I just feel like they're probably wasting tonnage by having that extra turret. But yes, with the SSMs, with her speed, her armor's still a little concerning. There's probably wasted tonnage, but that doesn't mean it's not a dangerous ship. It is a dangerous class for sure. Then Germany also has one of the world's larger gun capital ship forces, with 3 battle cruisers amounting to 100, or battleships amounting to 153,000 tons, and 2 battle cruisers to 88,000. The first battleship, Nassau, is rather old, from 37. 38,700 tons, 26 knots, 10 16-inch guns in 2 triple, 2 twin turrets, 14 6-inch, 8 4-inch, 13-inch belt. The choice of 6-inch guns was weird even when she was built. The armor is alright, but not spectacular in the modern era. The speed is quite nice. She still stands up acceptably, considering her speed is good, her armament is good. Well, her main armament is good. Her secondary armament is rather baffling and is not good at all. Not really. She'd be a lot better off with piles of 5-inch and 3-inch dual-purpose guns at this point. Her armor is probably a little on the weak side, but probably not terrible. I mean, it depends what the deck is as well, but Nassau isn't too bad. The secondary armament is actually her largest problem, along with maybe her armor. But it's not a terrible design. Then in 45, they built Hanover, 44,000 tons, 31 knots, 8 17-inch guns, in 2 quad turrets, 12.5-inch belt, 16 6-inch, 10 3-inch, dual purpose. Well, much like the Russian equivalent, this is either a really fast but otherwise bad battleship, or a slightly slow but quite formidable battle cruiser Again, I would say it's basically a battle cruiser, at which it would perform pretty damn well, probably. Although, still the weird choice to have a 6-inch secondary battery, which is definitely questionable. Then it'll be hamstringing its AA abilities now. They followed that with what is, I think, actually the single heaviest warship afloat. Yeah, pretty sure. I was just checking my carriers, but yeah. Pretty sure the single largest warship in the world, Lothringen, 70,000 tons, 27 knots, 10 17-inch guns, and 2 triple, 2 twin turrets, 14 6-inch, 16 4-inch, 12.5-inch belt, 6 aircraft. You know, the weird and sad thing about Lothringen is that for all her enormous tonnage, her speed is very impressive, her armament is very nice, albeit whether it's actually any better than 12 16-inch guns is probably up for debate, but it's very nice. Still a weird secondary layout, though. But her armor, her belt at least, is thoroughly unimpressive for a ship of her displacement. I would guess her deck is probably better, but still, it's not like belt has become irrelevant. I'm not too sold on Lothringen for how enormous her tonnage is. I mean, I'm not at all convinced that she would beat a 8,000-ton lighter Vermont, which has almost certainly more armor, same speed, pretty much equal armament, and on 8,000 tons less. So, yeah, I don't know about Lothringen. Not sold on her. Then most recently, they've built a pair of battle cruisers, Von der Ten and Hansa, 43,800 tons, 32 knots, 8 16-inch guns, and 4 twin turrets, 14 5-inch and 24 3-inch dual purpose, and an 11.5-inch belt. Well, this is just basically what you would expect a modern battlecruiser to look like. She's fast. She's fairly well armed, not spectacularly. Her armor is just a tiny bit below average, but probably not in a significant way. She actually does have a good secondary, tertiary armament with piles of dual purpose guns. There's nothing deeply wrong with Von der Tan at all. She doesn't necessarily stand out in any particular way, but I would say that's not necessarily a bad I mean, I would probably go with 3 triple turrets and probably save weight while gaining a gun barrel, but that's a relatively minor quibble. It doesn't mean that the existing ship is ineffective. I would say she's still quite dangerous. And then we come to the US, which definitely has the world's largest capital ship force still in service. 6 battleships for 333,000 tons, 3 battle cruisers for 148,000 tons. Now, 4 of our battleships, USS Colorado, New Mexico, Nevada, and Wyoming, are now getting on towards 30 years old, and are definitely showing their age a little. On the other hand, at 52,200 tons, 24 knots, 12 16-inch guns and 4 triple turrets, 24 5-inch dual purpose, 14-inch belt, 5-inch deck. The armament and the armor of the Pennsylvania class is still very formidable. They could definitely use an AA update, but the armor and armament baseline still very, very nice even today. The main problem with them is their speed, which is no longer very impressive at all. It was pretty nice when they were built, but not anymore. Almost everything in the water is faster than her. However, there's still hardly any battleships or battlecruisers in the world that would actually beat the Pennsylvania in a straight fight. There's a couple, such as our own more modern Vermonts, but not a lot. And there's a lot to be said for that. You know, if we're attacking, if we're in a position where the enemy can run away, then fine, they can run away. But running away is about the only choice they've got in almost all cases against the Pennsylvanias. So I don't know if these are going to be decommissioned anytime soon necessarily. Maybe if we come up with the funds to build another fast battleship class. But other than that, I would say they could definitely use an AA update. but against anything on the surface, they're still very formidable. Now, we do also have USS Vermont and Alabama from 10 years after that at 62,100 tons, 27 knots, 12 16-inch guns in 4 triple turrets, 24 5-inch dual purpose, 14-inch belt, 6-inch deck. They could also use some AA modernization for sure. But their armament and their armor stands up even better than the Pennsylvania's, and their speed is quite a bit less crippling. If I were to build a modern battleship class, I would probably aim for 30 knots, but in terms of armor and armament, there's, again, pretty much very little to nothing that can actually beat a Vermont out there. And her speed is still less than the modern sort of cruiser carrier-based fleets, but not so much less as to be hopelessly left behind, a reliability in most situations. So these are still overall pretty damn formidable. They could definitely use an AA update, though. I'll have to keep that in mind. As for battle cruisers, we have USS United States and Essex from the late 30s, 46,000 tons, 32 knots, 9 16-inch guns in 3 triple turrets all forward, 24 5-inch dual purpose, 12-inch belt, 4-inch deck. Well, again, they could use that AA update, but their speed, their armor, and their armament are still very much up the scratch for even the most modern battle cruisers, really. And I mean, there are a couple of battle cruisers that maybe would beat her out there. There's one or two with 17-inch guns that I saw, I think. Probably those Italian ones would beat them, albeit those are 10,000 tons heavier or something. But overall, the United States class still holds up quite nicely with, again, maybe that AA update I should look into, but there's not really a lot out there that beats these, and they're still fast enough to keep up with almost all modern cruisers, which means they can still do their cruiser killing job as well. And then we have Oriskany, the only survivor of her class, sadly, as we lost Valley Forge in a war with Japan, but 56,500 tons, 32 knots, 12 16-inch guns in 4 quad turrets all forward, 25-inch dual purpose, 12-inch belt, 5-inch deck. Still, yeah, okay, very good speed, battleship tier armament, battleship tier deck armor, honestly, even if the belt is a little thin. Oriskany, I think, is probably still the most dangerous battlecruiser out there. I think she would comfortably beat the Von der Tans and the Indomitables, and probably also the Sevastopols, to be honest. The Sevastopols at least have SSMs, but certainly the Cristoforo Colombos would be the closest, especially with their SSMs, but it's very likely, in my opinion, that Oriskany is still the most dangerous battlecruiser in the world, even over 10 years after her completion. That said, it might be time to think about a new generation of faster battleships, not because of any problem with their armament or armor, but just because of their speed. Overall, though, there are still some surface capital ships kicking around, especially battlecruisers. We're definitely maintaining the largest battleship force at the moment, and I really think they still have value, as long as we can give them air cover, but we have enough carriers that shouldn't be a problem. And we will get to carriers next. And it's nighttime again. Sorry guys, I really could not find time to do this all in one take this time around. Anyway, we've gone over surface capital ships, and now we move on to carriers. Spain has a grand total of 6 carriers, of which 3 are fleet carriers, 90,000 tons, 3 are light carriers, 60,000 tons. The light carriers would be all built in the last decade, interestingly. In fact, all of their carriers built in the last decade, which is certainly something. Matanza from 1950, 15,100 tons, 27 knots, 29 aircraft, 12 3-inch guns. I don't know if I'm fully convinced. Certainly, if The value of light carriers of this sort is a little questionable to me, especially arguably they'd be more useful to me because I could scatter them across the world to cover all the locations I need to cover. Spain really only has a very limited geographical area it needs to cover, right? Because ultimately, ton for ton and dollar for dollar, this is less efficient in carrying aircraft than a full-sized carrier would be, right? So I don't know if I'm sold on the whole idea, but clearly Spain and many other powers are, so we'll go with it. Anyway, well, that's why I don't have any light carriers, even though I maybe could use them to cover a lot of regions. So that's 29 aircraft. Then they have Grisuela, 13,500 tons, 26 knots, or 27 knots, 8 3-inch guns, 30 aircraft. And Zares, 15,800 tons, 27 knots, 8 3-inch guns, 29 aircraft. I mean, they're all basically pretty much the same. Okay, Zares has SAMs, actually. That's an advancement. Do all of them have? No, the other two don't. That's the major difference, then. I mean, slight differences in armament, yes. Speed is, I think, 27 knots for all of them, which is not very impressive, actually. Not really what you need when almost every cruiser in the world is making 30-plus knots. A light carrier should really be able to keep up with cruisers and or run away with them, and these cannot, so that's going to be a problem, probably. But I like the SAMs. Sorry. A little distracted there. I like the SAMs. I don't like how slow they are. I don't like how few aircraft they have. Dollar for dollar, there's almost no way they're better than a full-sized fleet carrier. Yes, they can cover more regions and have more holes, but I'm sure they're all, well, they are rather slow. That's the biggest problem with them as light carriers. Of course, there's a place for light carriers, but it's not really, these are just, they carry jets, same as a fleet carrier would. The modern sort of, helicopter, heavy, amphibious assault carrier type things that the U.S. has a lot of seem like a much better, they sort of fulfill a different role, though, but they work a lot better as a light carrier concept. Anyway, they have 2 Trio-class fleet carriers from the early 50s, 27,700 tons, 29 knots, 16 3-inch dual-purpose guns, carry 50 aircraft. I mean, for a fleet carrier, they're not terribly large, nor are they terribly fast. Their belt armor is kind of irrelevant, but I'm guessing they don't exactly have a ton of deck armor or hangar armor or anything either. But it's reasonable and acceptable. I mean, it's not like it's unusable. It's hard to screw up a carrier that bad in this game, at least. And then Saldana, 35,900 tons, 30 knots, 16 3-inch dual purpose, 3.5-inch belt, 69 aircraft. This one, at least, is getting up to a respectable size. She actually makes 30 knots. So, I mean, here's a shocker. The largest carrier is probably the best. I really don't like the 27-knot speed on all these light carriers. That will put them awfully vulnerable to cruisers in the modern era. Just pretty much any cruiser. Did any of these have... No, only Zaris has SAMs. That's an interesting... I mean, probably, arguably, carriers should have SAMs, so that's... well, or they could just depend on their aircraft, but that's an advancement for sure, at least. Now, Austria has a way heavier carrier force with 5 fleet carriers and 4 light for 250,000 tons of fleet carriers, 58,000 tons of light. Their light carriers would be Schwalbe, interestingly, also a very modern carrier force, almost all built in sort of the post-war era. Well, it's not exactly the post-war era in this world, but never mind that. They have Schwalbe from 1950, 14,000 tons, 28 knots, 8 3-inch dual-purpose guns, 28 aircraft. I mean, all of these light carriers, they basically have like cruiser-grade AA at best. They don't carry that many aircraft, although obviously they're relatively cheap and make up the numbers, but I'm not really sold on them, yeah. And then they have Iltis and Falke, 14,800 tons, 25 knots, 8 3-inch dual-purpose guns, 30 aircraft, only 25 knots? I mean, come on. I don't know if you can... I'm not sold on that at all. And they actually have a third Iltis, Cormorant, which they are refitting, apparently. For fleet carriers, they have Debrecen and Sigid from the mid-40s. 40,100 tons, 28 knots, 16 5-inch dual-purpose guns, 3-inch belt, 65 aircraft. Little on the slow side in 1960, really. But they carry a very healthy number of aircraft, and a very healthy AA armament as well. The 5-inch dual-purpose guns, enough to scare off destroyers as well, although, of course, if your carrier is being directly attacked by destroyers, something has probably gone wrong, but nonetheless, the speed's not great, though. Then Zonkt Pulten, 31,800 tons, 29 knots, 12 3-inch guns, 3-inch belt, 57 aircraft. Smaller, but otherwise basically the same in all regards. Actually a little faster, but yeah, sort of an interim between the two bigger classes, with Krakow and Banat following. 43,300 tons, 28 knots, 16 3-inch guns, 61 aircraft. Interesting that it's less than Debrecen despite being heavier, and the same speed too, and less belt armor. So I don't quite know where the weight went, other than it has more AA by a fair margin, so that's a good upgrade at least. Maybe it's got more deck armor or something as well. They're building a 55,000-ton carrier Slavonian, but she's not complete yet. Overall, much heavier force than Spain's. I am a little concerned about the speed of pretty much all of them, though. Japan actually has 8 carriers amounting to 600,000 tons, well, with the 4 building, but once those 4 are complete, they'll be back up to the second largest carrier force in the world, despite their recent defeat to us, in which they lost several carriers. But apparently that taught them the lesson that carriers are the way to go now. Also 7 light carriers for 98,000 tons. Their light carriers, Shimane Maru, a war survivor from 43, 15,200 tons, 31 knots, 12 5-inch dual-purpose, only carries 15 aircraft. Probably converted to jets, but that's a very questionably interesting. Was hit by missiles, I guess, from the air at the Battle of Tarawa. Fought 3 battles with us, managed to survive them all. Good for her. But 15 aircraft is a very this is a 15,000-ton ship, and you're lucky if you're getting a decent cap out of it, basically. So I'm not sold on that at all. Obviously, she's a pre-jet carrier, which did not convert terribly well. Then they have Unyo Shoho and Chigusa Maru of the Teo class. 14,100 tons, 28 knots, 8 3-inch dual-purpose, 28 aircraft, 28 knots. More respectable, although slower, enough to make a difference. But at least carries a somewhat reasonable enough aircraft to actually have a strike squadron worth mentioning on board. And I believe a lot more AA as well, yeah. With the medium radar guided guns. And then Kaio, Ryuho, and Shinho from 56, 13,500 tons, 26 knots, 8 3-inch guns, 30 aircraft. A lot of AA. Squeezes a lot of aircraft into a pretty budget-sized displacement, but 26 knots. I don't know that I'm okay with that at all. That's really awfully slow for a carrier. I mean, come on. They have two fleet carriers that are war survivors, being Zoikaku from 1939, 21,600 tons, 30 knots, 12 4-inch dual-purpose guns, 46 aircraft. Probably converted to jet operations, still carries a reasonable number of craft. Pretty solid number for her displacement, really. And makes 30 knots, so I would say this is a pretty good conversion. It looks nice, too. It's a good looking ship. All this paintwork actually generated really nicely by the game. Yeah, I would say that's a pretty successful conversion. I'm all right with Saikaku. Their other survivor, Shinano, 24,900 tons, 30 knots, 16 3-inch dual-purpose guns, 2.5-inch belt, 45 aircraft. Actually, interestingly, less aircraft for more tonnage than Zoikaku. I'm guessing that's going into armor, probably, and better AA as well. Medium radar guided AA guns are pretty heavy, but maybe these take up a lot of deck size. Don't remember which. Maybe a little both. But still not a terrible ship, at least. I mean, I don't see a huge flaw with it. Post-war, they built, well, during the war, they were trying to finish these, but didn't until after the war. Unryu, Amagi, Katsuragi, and Kirishima. 61,300 tons, 30 knots, 16 3-inch dual-purpose guns, 3-inch belt, carry no less than 128 jet aircraft, which I think is not only bigger than anything we have, but is probably makes them the biggest carriers in the world by capacity. We'll see what else we see, I guess, but that's an enormous aircraft complement. Now, I will say, just based on my own designs, in order to squeeze that onto that tonnage, they pretty much certainly sacrificed some deck and hangar armor or something. Definitely sacrificed something somewhere in there, but a very, very impressive combat load of jets from the Unryu class. And they're fast, they have reasonable AA, so I can't tell you what they sacrificed. It looks like a very, very impressive ship, and it probably is, but there's almost certainly something sacrificed in there. Then Haruna and Hiryu, also built post-war, 43,700 tons, 29 knots, 16 3-inch dual-purpose guns, 1.5-inch belt, 90 aircraft. Also, really cramming a lot of aircraft into her. Now, she is a little slow, and looks like, from the belt, like she's probably quite thinly armored. So it's a little more obvious what they've sacrificed for that here. But there's, I mean, theoretically, as long as you're winning, your speed and armor don't really matter that much on a carrier. It's when you're getting hit that's a problem. But as long as you get enough aircraft to completely swamp your opponent, maybe that doesn't matter that much. That's clearly Japan's theory, with something on the order of 700 aircraft from these 6 carriers. And they're building 4 Teiho class of over 60,000 tons as well. So they are really on it as far as rebuilding their carrier force goes. Now, Italy has 6 fleet carriers for 212,000 tons and 4 light for 94,000 tons. Obviously, they sacrificed that a little for the benefit of their battle cruiser force, although maybe not as badly as their light cruiser force, hopefully. They have the light carriers Sagittario and Andromeda from the late 30s, 14,200 tons, 30 knots, 6 5-inch guns, not dual purpose, 13 aircraft. Yeah, okay. They're fast enough. That's about it. They have quite mediocre AA for their size, especially with no dual purpose main guns. And they carry an absolute pittance of aircraft. This is not even really light carrier. This is like escort carrier level numbers of aircraft. And those weren't really ever intended to fight other carriers. It's not even a good escort carrier. Would probably still carry more than that, honestly. And then they have Antares and Altair from just about the same time, 10,700 tons, 31 knots. Dual purpose 4 5-inch, 12 4-inch, and 14 aircraft. So this is actually, interestingly, pretty much all around better than the Sagittarios, but still terrible. I mean, yes, it's fast. Okay, it's got dual purpose guns at least, so it's better for AA. Still only carries 14 aircraft, so it really begs the question, why do you even have this ship? That's just not enough aircraft to be worth the maintenance costs, honestly. It's never going to mount, a serious airstrike, really, on anything with any escort. And it's not like Italy has a bunch of sea regions to cover. It's just the Mediterranean. And maybe they still have a colony in East Africa or something, but maybe the fleet carriers could handle that. That said, okay, yeah. Two of their fleet carriers, Sparviero and Aron, are from the same era of the late 30s. 18,300 tons, 27 knots, 16 5-inch, not dual-purpose guns, 37 aircraft. This would be an example of a carrier that hasn't taken a specially willed jet conversion. Rather slow. Not really that many aircraft. I mean, for her size, all right-ish, but really not a lot of aircraft at all for a fleet carrier. No dual-purpose main armament. This thing is thoroughly obsolete at this point. You probably couldn't refit it in being good anyway. It's just too small for the jet era. Then Griffon and Falcone from the early 40s, 22,200 tons, 28 knots, 8 4-inch dual purpose, and 50 aircraft. I note Falcone has listed as 76, which probably means she hasn't even been converted to jets, which in 1960 is a little bit unforgivable, to be honest. So, I mean, yes, this carries a more worthwhile number of aircraft. It's still kind of slow. Its AA is still not that great. I'm not sold on these at all either. Now, their most recent class, the Condor and Nibio from the early 50s, 47,200 tons, 29 knots, 16 3-inch dual-purpose guns, and 95 aircraft. So they've at least poured a lot of aircraft into this, and it's not so terribly slow, if not terribly fast either, but I mean, it's 13,000 tons lighter than one of my carriers with 102 aircraft, which pretty much guarantees that there are some major. Now, if this is like a short range, cramped type aircraft carrier, Italy can get away with that a lot better than I can, considering they do mostly operate in the Mediterranean. But you got to bear in mind, looking at that 95 aircraft, that they've definitely given up something for that, because the tonnage doesn't add up otherwise. Could be armor too. I mean, this belt on the carriers tells us pretty much nothing. It's the hangar deck and the deck armor that matters. Flight deck armor that matters a lot more. And we have no idea what that might be. Overall, I mean, the two newest carriers at least look nice, but Italy's force is rather obsolete for the most part. Their carriers have been quite neglected. So then France. France has 14 carriers amounting to 576,000 tons in service, plus 5 light carriers for 89,000 tons. By numbers, that's the second most fleet carriers, although Japan, once it has its 12 in service, will have more tonnage than France's 16 that it'll then have. Currently, France is probably still second on overall tonnage. Considering Japan's 4 aren't finished yet, it'll drop to third. But it's quite a force, but it's also definitely less heavy on average than Japan's. As for the light carriers, they have Dauphine from 44, 15,300 tons, 32 knots, 12 5-inch dual-purpose guns, 15 aircraft. Yet none of these pre-jet light carriers were worth the expense of converting. They just don't carry enough aircraft post-jet conversion. Then People and Dixmude from 51, 15,100 tons, 27 knots, 12 3-inch dual-purpose, 29 aircraft. Look, it's a decent complement of aircraft. She's still rather slow, not well armored. I'm just not sold on jet era light carriers necessarily. I do think one fleet carrier most of the time would probably beat two or three light carriers. I mean, granted that carrier versus carrier operations often have quite a bit of luck involved, but still. Then Souverain and Sans Colot, 15,000 tons, 27 knots, 8 3-inch dual purpose, 31 aircraft. I mean, pretty much same. Like, carries what, two more aircraft, same speed, slightly less AA, similar tonnage. Not any significant difference, really. They're building an even smaller one, Ville de Paris. Then, as for their carriers proper, well, the oldest is Lafayette from 1937. 28,800 tons, 28 knots, 16 5-inch dual purpose guns, 35 aircraft. Not the most impressive jet conversion, really. She carries 35 aircraft, and this light thing that's half her tonnage carries 31 aircraft. Yes, Lafayette does have better dual purpose armament, AA, and is a little bit faster, but not enough to make it worth it. I mean, this is actually an argument in favor of light carriers, if anything, because this is not an efficiently built fleet carrier at all. Obviously, she didn't take to jet conversion that well. Then Painlevé, Bois-Belou, Foch, and Rochambeau from the early 40s, 39,200 tons, 29 knots, 16 5-inch dual purpose, 69 aircraft. These probably weren't built for jets, but if not, they did take the conversion pretty well. They carry a very respectable number of aircraft. They're not too slow, although not too great either. And a reasonable armament, not spectacular, but acceptable. So I would say these are pretty decent, average type fleet carriers. They then chose to build Commandant Test and Clemenceau, which at 21,000 tons, 29 knots, 12 4-inch dual purpose, and 43 aircraft. Well, they carry a pretty efficient number of aircraft for their tonnage, although on the other hand, well, yeah, for 6,000 more tons than a Souverain type, it's a pretty good increase in number of aircraft and a little bit of extra speed, but not really that much extra armament in AA, nor actually that much extra armor. So this is almost just like a large light carrier in a lot of ways, which carriers do scale pretty linearly, but like, yeah. In the early 50s, and then the last one wasn't finished until 58 for some reason, but they built Verdun, Sirocco, and Foudre, 43,300 tons, 800 tons, 30 knots, 16 3-inch dual-purpose guns, 84 aircraft. Now this is how you use 40,000 tons, and it looks a lot better than the Painlevs, really. Fast, plenty of aircraft, very heavy armament of radar-directed medium AA. This is a very nice, formidable fleet carrier for its size. And then more recently, they've built Neptune, Tonnerre, Sul, and Mistral, which, oddly enough, went right back down in size again. 26,800 tons, 30 knots, 8 3-inch dual-purpose guns, 51 aircraft, 22 radar-guided medium AA guns. Well, look, it's small, but for its size and its budget, it's actually doing quite nicely. Very impressive radar-guided AA loadout, good speed, good number of aircraft for her displacement. So I would say the Neptune class is pretty nice, actually, despite its small size. I mean, obviously, larger carriers will beat them, but I think they're getting the most out of their tonnage, relatively speaking. They're building two 55,000 tonners, Navarre and Rhone, but not completed yet. Then we have Britain. Britain has 9 fleet carriers for 522,000 tons, with 2 building, which is the actual total, and then 8 light carriers for 99,000 tons. The light carriers, well, Audacity and Attacker date back to the late 30s, 10,600 tons, 28 knots, 6.5-inch non-dual purpose, 14 aircraft. Again, pre-jet light carrier, really just doesn't carry enough aircraft to be worth it. And I mean, it's a question of role. This thing could maybe escort convoys. It could perhaps carry a bunch of helicopters to help a amphibious assault. What it could not do is really project power on its own effectively in any way. And she wasn't. Well, that's sort of the problem. She probably was built for independent operations. She's not actually remotely capable of that with the number of aircraft she has now. Nor will the game use her in any of the ways that a sort of amphibious assault ship or escort carrier would be used. She'll just be in a clump of light carriers fighting other light carriers during cruiser engagements or something, in which case she probably won't have enough aircraft to affect the outcome of the cruiser engagement, and she's slow enough that cruisers will probably run her down pretty easily. Then we have Pursuer and Stalker and Khedive from the mid-40s. 11,000 tons, 30 knots, 8.5-inch dual purpose, 15 aircraft, also a pre-jet conversion. At least she's fast, but then a good tonnage ratio. Well, at least she's cheap, but it's not a good tonnage ratio, not with how few aircraft she mounts. Premier and Charger from the mid-50s, 15,000 tons, 27 knots, 8 3-inch guns, 31 aircraft. Well, she manages to carry a reasonable number of aircraft, but at the cost of a pretty questionable speed. So, I mean, at least it's good AA armament, but I'm not sold on this either. Now, as for their fleet carriers, they have Hermes and Formidable from the late 30s to 40, 37,400 tons, 30 knots, 16 4-inch dual purpose, 70 aircraft. Well, that's these were very large. I'm pretty sure they carried over 100 aircraft piston at the time. 70 post-conversion is not bad, and with their speed, their dual-purpose armament, their armor, they don't have the very latest and greatest in AA necessarily, but I would say these are pretty successful jet conversions and are definitely still worth keeping around for Britain. Especially as their first pure jet carrier, HMS Ark Royal of 1949, 31,900 tons, 30 knots, 12 3-inch guns, only carries 60 aircraft and is noticeably smaller. I mean, still with her speed, her improved and very heavy AA armament, good number of aircraft for her displacement. This is a very nice fleet carrier nonetheless. But it goes to show how well the Hermes actually did upon being converted. Now, here's the questionable thing. The Furious class, HMS Furious, Illustrious, and Implacable, 48,800 tons, 29 knots, 16 3-inch dual-purpose guns, 2-inch belt, 57 aircraft. They're not exceptionally fast. In fact, they're probably a bit slower than I'd like. Their armor doesn't seem to be exceptional from the belt. Their AA armament is good, but not exceptional, including their secondaries. And they really don't have a lot of aircraft for their displacement, considering what Ark Royal or Hermes has. So where is all the weight going on the Furious class? I can only guess that maybe somewhere that I can't see, they have a super armored, hangar or flight deck or etc. But if so, I guess that would be accurate to Britain in some ways, at least for the World War II era. But they've probably gone too far with it, because this is a carrier that should probably carry 80 aircraft or something. And they've stripped away a really substantial proportion of that. And she doesn't even have the speed or the AA is all right, but she doesn't particularly have the speed. She doesn't particularly have the aircraft. I'm a little baffled. I'm guessing she's got really good armor somewhere that I can't see, but it's possible they've wasted it on something else that I don't understand or see. As it is, I'm a little confused by her aircraft to weight ratio. The armor thing is the only thing I can guess, but that's not certain. And then HMS Argus, Audacious, and Colossus from the late 50s. 45,200 tons, 29 knots, 16 3-inch dual purpose, 2.5-inch belt, 63 aircraft. Not quite as egregious as the Furious class, 3,000 tons lighter and 6 more aircraft, but honestly does leave me with the same question. I'm pretty sure they should be able to fit more than 63 aircraft on 45,000 tons. So I'm not quite sure where all the aircraft are. Considering they have 37,000 or 70 aircraft on a 37,000 ton ship that wasn't even designed for jet operations. I don't know. I'm guessing Britain's got a lot of armor on some of those carriers, but it's not possible to say for sure. Russia, then, has neglected its carrier arm a bit, really, in order to focus on its cruisers and its gun capital ships. They have only 7 fleet carriers, amounting to just 235,000 tons, which actually puts them ahead of Italy and Spain, but behind Austria-Hungary on tonnage. And 2 light carriers for 28,000 tons. The light carriers are Donets from 42, 13,000 tons, 30 knots, 85-inch guns, dual purpose, and 15 aircraft. Well, at least they're dual purpose, but it's still a pre-jet conversion. It's not good. And then Chelyabinsk, 15,100 tons, 27 knots, 12 3-inch dual purpose, 29 aircraft. Carries more aircraft at least, but noticeably slower, which was the one thing I praised about Donets. So, yeah, they're light carriers. They don't really have a purpose at the moment. So why do they exist? Yeah. Then for fleet carriers, they have Gorky, left over from the late 30s, 29,000 tons, 29 knots, 16 5-inch dual-purpose guns, non-radar guided medium AA, I notice. 86 aircraft, allegedly. That number on that tonnage makes me really, really question if maybe they have not converted this to jet operations. And if they haven't, she's pure garbage, of course. It's 1960. Jets are pretty mature at this point. Not full. Well, I say not fully. It's not like, I mean, okay, the U.S. Navy in 1960 was operating almost solely jet aircraft by that point. There probably were, well, somebody in the comments will tell me if I'm wrong, but I don't really think there were any prop aircraft left in frontline combat roles by that time. Certainly not in any kind of air superiority role or contested airspace attack role. Maybe for direct ground support or something. But not for anything that needed to go fast, I wouldn't think. So I have my strong suspicion that this is still operating propeller aircraft. If so, it's sheer trash. Now, if they have managed to convert it to jets and it still has 86 aircraft, then it's actually brilliant, and I take it all back. But I really don't think they could manage that on that tonnage. As perhaps evidenced by the more modern Novosibirsk and Yerevan, which on 39,600 tons, 10,000 more, have 4 less aircraft with 82. 29 knots, 16 3-inch dual purpose, heavy medium AA armament. Well, a little slower than I'd like, but a pretty bog standard modern fleet carrier, and a pretty high number of aircraft for its tonnage, but a believable number. So I'd say they've done well with these two, really. They then built Omsk, Sverdlovsk, Akulino, and Mozgovo. which 31,800 tons, 29 knots, 16 3-inch dual purpose, 63 aircraft. I mean, basically just a scaling down of the Novosibirsk's. A bit less armor, but also carrying a respectable number of aircraft for their tonnage. Not huge and powerful carriers for the modern era, but pretty nice still. That's where it ends for Russia, though. They don't have anything. Well, the Novosibirsks are quite nice, but they're the peak of their fleet at the moment. They don't have a whole lot of carriers or very big carriers around. And that'll take us over to Germany, which has 12 carriers for 325,000 tons, plus 7 light carriers for 100,000 tons, which is the largest light carrier force in the world by tonnage. Unfortunately, in my opinion, that's probably not something to brag about too much. They have Prims from 45, 10,900 tons, 29 knots, 8 5-inch dual purpose, 32 aircraft, non-radar AA. I mean, it's a pretty respectable number of aircraft for how cheap this thing probably is to operate. But given the armor is question mark, might actually be 0 or like half-inch of belt or something. And the AA is not radar guided. She's not been fully modernized, really. And hopefully she was built with jets in mind, but I'm not sure she would have been. It's possible she's another one that's still operating prop aircraft. 45, it's a bit up in the air whether she would have been built for jets or not. I'm kind of giving her the benefit of the doubt on that one, but it's a lot of aircraft for her tonnage, so it might just be that she's still operating propellers, especially given the Salzach, Jade, Sventine, Vaser, Varno, and Uyker built in the 50s, which at 15,000 tons, 28 knots, 12 3-inch dual purpose, carry only 29 aircraft, plus a heavier AA armament, or radar guided. But that really begs the question, is Prim still operating prop aircraft? But anyway, these, what is this, 7? 6. Okay, these 6 are pretty bog standard modern light carriers. They're just a little too slow. They don't really carry that many aircraft, enough to have a strike squadron, but oftentimes they're going to feel more like the mouse than the cat when they come up against cruisers, I'm really thinking. Especially with SAM-equipped heavy cruisers entering the scene, like, I'm just not sure I'd rather have this than an equivalently sized cruiser. I think there's a pretty good chance that under most average scenarios, the cruiser actually wins. Especially if they both have a task group or something. The cruiser's massed AA would more than make up for the carrier having an escort. Yeah, not sold on the light carriers, but maybe. They're not terrible for being light carriers anyway, let's put it that way. For fleet carriers, they have the old Derflinger from 42, 23,700 tons, 29 knots, 16 4-inch dual purpose, 42 aircraft. A little on the small side for a jet conversion. Reasonable, not great speed. Older, I mean, modified, modernized AA armament, but not a lot of guns because of that. Not a whole bunch of aircraft, really. I mean, for her size, well, doesn't compare all that. It compares a little favorably to the Saltzachs, maybe. Not spectacular. However, to be fair, the next couple of classes make her look pretty nice, as they then built Goben, Peter Strasser, and Hertha in the late 40s, which are 19,700 tons, 27 knots, 16 3-inch dual purpose, 33 aircraft, 2.5-inch belt, heavy, medium AA radar guided armament. Look, I don't even know why. Some of these fleet carriers do seem to make the argument for light carriers. This thing literally carries 4 more aircraft than a Goben that's 5,000 tons lighter and probably even more than that, proportionally cheaper. It's slower by a knot than Salzach. It does have heavier AA, but really not by much. I really question what the extra 5,000 tons were even put into on Goeben. Armor? Maybe? Possibly? Yeah. For an alleged fleet carrier, this thing does not carry enough aircraft. It's also too slow. Its AA is fine, but not that much better than any other ship of its size, or other ships of its size might even have better. I think these three are terrible. Why did they build these? They should have just built. I know I've been criticizing light carriers a lot, but for this displacement of a fleet carrier, quote unquote, they should have just gone with more light carriers. Why did they build these? And they then followed with York, Blankensee, Grunau, Kratzeburg, yeah, and Windeck, which 19,700 tons, 29 knots, 16 3-inch dual purpose, 32 aircraft. What's even the difference? They have a slightly thicker belt armor and one less aircraft? Literally worse then. All 8 of these are complete trash. They actually would have been better off just building light carriers with 30 aircraft. They haven't scaled the fleet carrier enough to actually get the benefits of a more, independent operations capable, well armored sort of unit. They just have a really lame fleet carrier here that's going to be more expensive than a light carrier with pretty much the same capabilities as a light carrier. They seemed to be finally learning that lesson just a couple of years ago when they built Nieuwede and Boppard, which at 62,300 tons, 29 knots, 16 3-inch dual-purpose guns, carry 4-inch belt, carry 84 aircraft. Very nice AA armament. Although not that much better than a much lighter ship, really. I think that's a thing with the game scaling of it, though. Not like you just can't put that much medium AA on, regardless of how big your ship is. You run out of deck space much the same time. Anyway, its armor is apparently good. In fact, I'm guessing its armor is very good all around, just based on the number of aircraft it has compared to its tonnage. Its speed is not that great. Its AA armament is probably alright, but nothing special. It doesn't carry that many aircraft for its tonnage, which does make me suspect it's very well armored. But it carries an acceptable number of aircraft, especially if it is very well armored. And it's definitely a lot better than these not really fleet carriers that Germany's been mostly building. Unfortunately, they then built Horstdorf, which is another York class in literally every way. I don't even know how it's a separate class. It looks exactly the same to me. No, wait. It has way less light AA. What they've gained by taking off the light AA, it's probably not that useful, but what they've gained for taking it off, I don't know. I don't see anything. Maybe armor somewhere else or something. But a slightly maybe upgraded York, is not what they needed. So unfortunately, although Germany has a lot of carriers, I would count roughly 2 of them as actual modern fleet carriers, one of them as a pretty successful older conversion, and the other 9 are complete garbage. I don't know what the hell they're doing. They would have been better off with 9 light carriers. Anyway, the U.S. currently has 16 fleet carriers, amounting to 827,000 tons, which the second largest total in the world is about 725,000 from Japan with fleet and light carriers once they finish stuff. So the U.S. does have the largest carrier force in the world by not necessarily total number of hulls because of people adding light carriers to their fleet carriers, but has the most fleet carriers and the most total carrier tonnage altogether. The oldest of the fleet are the 4 Ticonderogas, which were built in the mid-40s and converted to jet operations. USS Ticonderoga, Ranger, Intrepid, and Antietam, 38,200 tons, 30 knots, 16 5-inch and 10 3-inch dual-purpose guns, 58 aircraft, 8 medium radar-guided AA guns. They're fast. They're relatively well armored, thick deck, and a bit of flight deck armor, which it's very hard for me to judge, obviously, how well other carriers are armored. The belt is kind of pointless, or just more nominal than anything on most of these. It's the deck and flight deck that really matter on a carrier for the most part. And I can't see that at all, obviously. I just have to guess based on their aircraft to tonnage ratio. But there's a lot of other things that can affect that. Anyway, fast. A very nice number of aircraft, especially for a pre-jet carrier that was converted. Obviously, she's not going to have... Actually, I can't remember. We might have managed to install angled flight decks on these. Obviously, they don't show up in the picture, but we might have. Showing its age a little just in that it is a conversion. It doesn't have the latest in AA. It doesn't have the most aircraft, but it's still... The Ticonderoga class is a very respectable number of aircraft that is not terrible compared to everyone else's carriers. We then built the 4 Shangri-Las, USS Shangri-La, Hornet, Bennington, and Starjumper, all launched in 1950. So now 10 years old, 47,000 tons, 32 knots, which makes them some of the fastest carriers in the world. It's weird to me how little the AI prioritizes speed on their carriers, actually. I mean, I get it, they shouldn't be close enough to things that they have to run away directly. But I, for one, really prefer that my carriers be fast enough to outrun opposing capital ships. Surface capital ships. I mean, gun capital ships, you know? And cruisers and the like. It's good. And to reposition. I mean, it's good to have fast carriers. I don't know why the AI builds 25-knot carriers sometimes in the 1950s. But anyway, 32 knots, 16 4-inch and 10 3-inch dual-purpose guns, 72 aircraft, 3-inch deck, and 1-inch flight deck. Could probably stand to have more radar-guided AA guns. Apparently the AI itself will build ships with like 20 pretty easily, even though the builder often warns you that more than 8 is somewhat excessive or something. Apparently I should just ignore that. But anyway... This class all served in the war with Japan, of course. All did well in that war, I would say. They were kind of the mainstay of the fleet in the early war period. Until we started building the Yorktowns. And so they helped us win that war. And they're still very nice fleet carriers. They've got a good number of aircraft for their size. Pretty good AA armament, especially with all those dual-purpose guns. They're very fast. They're pretty well armored. Happy with them. That being said, the remaining half of our carrier force consists of the 8 ships of the Yorktown class: USS Yorktown, Wasp, Bonhomme Richard, Lake Champlain, Randolph, Hamilton, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and Kearsarge. Built, well, the first 4 were built basically in 54, 55, 56. Kearsarge was delayed all the way to 59 due to our post-war budget issues. But all of them are the same. 60,800 tons, 32 knots, 16 3-inch dual-purpose guns, 3-inch belt, 3-inch deck, 1-inch flight deck, 102 aircraft. So I'm pretty sure the only carriers in the world with more aircraft than these are the new Japanese ones, which I'm guessing are pretty lightly armored and aren't as fast either. Pretty respectable. Not the greatest AA. Apparently, I should just be going ham and putting tons of medium AA guns on and ignoring what the builder says about not putting more than like 8 on, or it's excessive. Apparently that's not really a problem. But very fast, reasonably well armored, tons of aircraft. Obviously the size and cost justify those or allow those tons of aircraft, but that's just what you get when you're the US sometimes. And it's 1960. AA is still decent. overall, I mean, it's between these and those new Japanese carriers for most powerful carriers in the world. I suspect these are better armored, and they're definitely faster. It's probably a bit of a toss-up, though. It's pretty impressive ships the Japanese built with the Unryus. They're still fast, and they probably have better. They definitely have a better AA armament. Really, the light AA guns are of questionable value in the modern era. So me having that many is just to make up for the game seemingly not wanting me to put a lot of medium AA guns on. That being said, they're comparable enough to each other that it's probably a bit of a toss-up depending on who gets the first strike in. And we do have more, which is always nice. But anyway, that brings us to a close so far as the fleets of the world go. Obviously, the US fleet is currently both the physically largest and overall the most technically advanced, particularly all of our destroyers and a relatively large proportion of our light cruisers are missile armed, and we're working on getting that to all of our light cruisers and heavy cruisers as well, which I expect we'll do well before the AI does. We also definitely have the world's most powerful carrier force and the world's most powerful surface ship, that is gun armed capital ship force. I am impressed by how aggressively and successfully Japan is rebuilding its carrier force post war. Germany, for being the second largest fleet in the world, I'm not so impressed by. A lot of their capital ships, I mean, Lothringen is literally the biggest ship in the world, and I'm not convinced she would beat one of our Vermonts, right? And their carrier force is a bit of a joke, actually, other than the Neuvids. So I'm not too sold on Germany as the second largest fleet in the world. Britain is doing all right. France does have a lot of carriers, but no gun capital ships, and I mean their carrier force is better than Germany's, but not that great. They keep oscillating between big and small ships. Italy has a ridiculous proportion of battle cruisers, but has kind of neglected everything else. Austria, Hungary, and Spain and Russia are all super heavy on heavy cruisers, basically. Although Russia does at least have battle cruisers and battle ships as well. Passable battle cruiser class. So that's the overall situation. The world is steadily transitioning towards missile armed destroyers and cruisers. The US is a solid leg ahead in that. But we'll see if the other powers can catch up. They probably can't for budgetary reasons, but eventually, of course, everyone will have missile armed ships. But it'll take a while. Surface. I keep saying surface. Obviously, carriers are also surface ships. It's just that they don't really have. Yeah, I don't know why I keep calling the gun armed ships. Whatever. Gun armed capital ships are kind of slowly on their way out, but not entirely. Notably, Russia and Italy have both built new classes of battle cruiser very recently, and most of the major powers still have some around well past when in the real world they would have gotten rid of them at this point. That said, carriers are the dominant capital ships at this point. There are a lot of light carriers around, not too convinced about those, but it's the big fleet carriers. The big fleet carriers that are really the arbiters of the balance of power at this point, and that is one of the categories where the US is doing very well, I would say. Quite impressed by Japan, though. Anyway, I believe that's going to be all for this special for now. Thank you, everybody, very much for watching. Sorry about all the cuts. I hope you all have a nice day. This is Sea Lord Janda, signing off.